Hi, it's Ron Turpin, your host of PODigal Sons. PODigal Sons is a podcast in which we discuss a wide variety of Christian topics. We also cover topics that affect humanity in general, and we are covering the Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Today is the fifth installment of our Bible Companion series. It is episode 6. So glad to get started with you guys. Wish I could do these more often, but it does require a lot of research. So I'm aiming to get one out at least every 2 weeks right now, but apologize for the delay. So I wanted to go ahead and go over the pre-show notes before we get into Genesis chapters 28. We're going to do Genesis chapters 28 through 36 today. If you have not read those chapters first before listening to the podcast, I would highly recommend that you read those chapters. Again, I'm not going to read each chapter. This is really going to be, a summary version of these events, and we're going to talk about the sort of the in-depth underlying things that are going on. But I would highly recommend that you read these chapters first, so you can have just a more full understanding of the Bible. So I wanted to kind of go through a couple of pre-show notes, like I mentioned. One thing I think I missed from the last episode is Rebecca, when she is feeding those camels. It is giving it's following a command of Christ, even though this is thousands of years before Christ. In that she went the extra mile, and I think that's important to recognize her kindness. And I think about the depiction in the Chosen series, when Christ and his followers are encountering the Romans, and I get part of what the law was back in the day is like if the Romans were having to travel a certain distance, they could sort of conscript anybody that they encountered, that was under their rule, to carry their things with them for a mile, or whatever maybe the certain distance was. In a way, they're kind of working for the Roman soldiers. So it's just an interesting thing and I love the way that the Chosen series depicts this. But what Christ basically does is he not only does he carry these things for the Roman shoulders, but he offers to go an additional mile. And at the end after the second mile, you can really see how it sort of flips this power dynamic. And the Romans are, at first, they were more than willing to let this happen, but towards the end, you can kind of tell, like, okay, that's enough. That's my gear. And so it's just really interesting to watch that scene. I would watch that again, just to watch this whole power dynamic flip, which is, that's what Christ comes in to do. But also just to see how his followers, at some point he said, go the extra mile. And then to actually see this happen, they started to understand, like, this guy, actually does what he says he's going to do, and he practices what he preaches. But going the extra mile for people and just sort of volunteering yourself, not only to do what's necessary, but to go out beyond that, it does do something special for people. And I think Rebecca was exhibiting this command by Christ. So I wanted to make sure we hit that. Another thing that I haven't really, I guess, portrayed is that Noah is alive to like almost through Abraham's life. So the word of, this oral tradition that's passed down from Noah to the next generation, that's very much out there. And so with that, we have to understand that a lot of these things didn't get lost over time, because Noah lived so long that he was able probably to give the word and these accounting of events that happened directly to Abraham, which that is important moving forward. It'll probably come up later at some point. But I did want to put that out there. And yes, the Tower of Babel happened, and these people got spread out. And at some point, the word probably, or the tradition, these oral traditions probably got lost in a lot of these societies and these cultures, as far as following the one true God. But keep in mind, Noah is still alive. So that's how these stories get passed down. And that's probably why there's so many other cultures in these people like Abimelech and the Hittites that feared God, because there's the word of God is kind of coming from multiple sources, Noah being one, Abraham. So just something I wanted to make sure that we were aware of. Another thing on Noah, this whole curse of Canaan is starting to, I'm really starting to focus in on that. And I think that it does a lot more disruption than people realize. Because what it's doing, this curse of Canaan, is it's separating people. And it's sort of causing there to be an eternal, almost, not a true eternal, but what seems like what's going to be a forever separation with the Israelites and the Canaanites. And it kind of creates these Gentiles. And reading more into it and realizing that this was something completely done by Noah, and it's not supported by God. I don't, that part I probably need to really, maybe we could do just a podcast on it or something. But finding God's role in that, and kind of really not having anything that supports that as far as any commandments from God, but having it be more of just something that Noah said and that was recorded, and people really clung on to that. And it's like, where is your heart at? And that's and it's easy to hang on to something like that if your heart is full of hate. It's easy to say, these people are excluded. Let's exclude these people forever from the family of God. But Christ comes in and completely rewrites that, as far as welcoming the Gentiles back into the family of God and into the kingdom. It's just an interesting part of this, of kind of how the Bible is set up, and how really how the Israelites got set up and into their thinking. And I think where it originated from, as far as excluding people from the family of God, that they knew it as. I think it's a bigger part of Genesis than maybe that is talked about. So I'm going to probably do more research into that, and maybe even talk to people about that. So, and I have had a lot of good interactions, a lot of positive interactions with people, with fellow YouTubers that have commented. I just wanted to shout out to one commenter, Akib Shabazz. I think I'm saying it right. I really appreciate the comment or the back and forth that we were able to have regarding Isaac and Ishmael. And I just want to say, there's a lot of respect there. It's different than probably the first 4 episodes, where anybody that were in the comments was a lot more combative, which I don't mind being combative, but it does eventually kind of turn into somewhat of and I don't want to throw this word out there so loosely, but what kind of almost felt like harassment from one commenter, and his tired of liars. Well, I don't know where you are, but I'm praying for you. I'm glad you stopped commenting so much negativity on my videos. But I'm hoping that you come to Christ eventually, or come back to Christ. And I do recognize that you are having a struggle with your faith. But I do thank you for at least engaging in the video. So, tired of liars, if you're out there watching, I'm praying for you. But back to Akib Shabazz and the comment that was posted, and what we were going back and forth on is really how Isaac and Ishmael are viewed from the Judeo-Christian sort of perspective, and then the Islamic perspective. And there's some differences there, obviously. But I could actually, I see both sides and how they're viewed. I'll go ahead and read his comment from 2 weeks ago. In the Bible, Genesis 22, the story of the sacrifice involves Isaac. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham obeys. However, the Bible also shows that Ishmael is important to God's plan. Yes, I agree with that. In Genesis 17, 18, 19, God promises Abraham that Ishmael will also be blessed. Yes, that does happen. But the covenant will pass through Isaac. Exactly. So while Isaac is chosen for the covenant, it doesn't mean that Ishmael is ignored. God says both sons will have roles in his plan. And then he says, addressing the chosen son point, the Bible focuses on Isaac as the heir to God's promise, but this does not deny Ishmael's significance. Both sons are part of God's promise, with Isaac being one through whom the covenant continues, and Ishmael being blessed by God as well. And I think that's where it probably starts differentiating itself from Christianity or from Judaism, I guess. But I do see that Ishmael is blessed, although I'm not sure if I would say that it's part of God's promise necessarily. I mean, God does make a promise that he will be blessed. But I think that's where it starts separating itself, which I see the promise as more being the covenant. But anyways, I'll finish your comment. So he says, so the Bible and the Quran both agree that Ishmael is the son of sacrifice, but the Bible also says that Isaac is the son chosen for the covenant. They don't contradict each other. They simply focus on different aspects of God's plan. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. As far as Ishmael being the Bible agreeing, or the Bible and the Quran both being in agreement that Ishmael is a son of sacrifice, that I would probably have to go and even honestly just do more research on. And what I responded with is, I don't think these things necessarily contradict each other. I could see how we could view Ishmael as a son of sacrifice. And really, both of these sons kind of went through some pretty traumatic things. I mean, Ishmael sort of being just excluded, and then Isaac having to go through an instance where he seemed like he was going to be sacrificed. I'm sure that stayed with him for a long time. So both of these sons, had some things they had to deal with. And I do think people overlook Ishmael, or I do think Christians overlook Ishmael and the promise that was made to him. But I feel like from here is probably where things start to really become different, as far as the views. Like everything up until this point could be probably, there's probably some similarities in those stories in the early parts of Genesis, but at this point is where things really start to become different. I think one of the differences in the Quran, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Allah, or who is that's the term. A lot of people know this already. I'm just going through it, but Allah is what is referred to as God by the Islamic religion. I think in that version of how in the story of Abraham sending Ishmael out into the desert, in the Quran, it's Allah that tells Abraham to send him out into the desert, whereas in the Bible, it's just that Abraham is just making this decision to do it. But I can see how Ishmael would be the son of sacrifice in that story. As far as the difference, whether God told him to do this or not, I would probably need an entire research project on going through that. And honestly, it's something that we're going to have to do at another time. Also, Akib Shabazz did recommend that I react to some videos. I would be more than willing to do that at some point. I am going to put an emphasis on other religions, other cultures, because that is a part of a lot of people's journeys. It's not fair, honestly, to just be so narrow-minded, especially when you're talking about the God of Abraham, right? I mean, we're brothers in that sense, that we have a lot of the same origins. So anybody that, just because they're different, we do have to spend some time trying to understand what they believe, and honestly, it's just a fair way to view which direction you're going to go. I don't just follow Christianity because I was born into Christianity. I follow Christianity because I recognize all the different aspects of different religions, and different things, different beliefs, and the different virtues that they exhibit. And there's reasons why I just don't follow, Islam, just based on things that, looking at the Spark Notes version of it, and going through every major difference, like polygamy being one, obviously, and just several other differences of why, I don't recognize that as truth. And there's just, obvious things there. But when you talk about whether it's Islamic religion or Mormons or whatever other thing, I do think it's important that we understand them, because if you're evangelizing with someone and you're trying to get them to understand Christ, then you really truly need to sort of view it from their shoes, and you have to understand what they believe. You also have to be knowledgeable in the different things that they believe. So the Quran is something that we probably would do a podcast on eventually, and understanding, just kind of briefly, like, what are the differences there. But I am glad to see the engagement from that community. And it is one that already is a lot more respectful than I've noticed with some of the atheist community, whether that's Professor Dave or whatever other commenter. There's a respect there, and I appreciate that. And I really, really, like the back and forth. Another thing too, and eventually we have to start the actual Bible companion part of this, but we're sort of quick to hold on to this. What God says about Ishmael is that he will war with other nations, but it doesn't say that his descendants are going to be in this eternal war with other nations. That's mentioned by Jacob, or we'll cover it in this series, but that's mentioned by somebody else. I think we're too quick sometimes to just, and I probably made that fault, and that's something that I've been thinking about, and I'm glad I had the engagement with, because I was able to sort of really rethink some of that. And I think we're quick to say, hey, these people are just destined to live a life of war. And I think that I was wrong in saying that this prophecy extends down to the descendants of Ishmael, because it definitely doesn't have to. We don't need to carry that prejudice just because of a certain heritage. We can all come back to the Father through Christ, and that's exactly what happened with the Gentiles. So why would that apply to why wouldn't that apply to the Islamic religion as well, or the descendants of Ishmael? Christ came for everyone, including the Gentiles. Nowhere does it say that anyone will be permanently excluded. This verse that God said about Ishmael was just giving the truth about that one man. But just like the Canaanites or any other group, we've seen kings who have, so far, just in what we've read, we've seen kings who have feared God. We will see Egyptian women who fear God. There are Gentiles in the New Testament that have more faith than the Jewish people. And so we don't need to carry this being at war with other nations into the current ages, because we are all under a new covenant. And ultimately, the obvious reason that these places are at war is not anything to do with some prophecy necessarily, but it's because of they don't have Christ. And I do see that as a common denominator sort of in the Middle East. There seems to be an absence of Christ in a lot of these societies where there is a continual war. I mean, look at North Korea, and who is sort of always, I guess, on the hot seat with that, but also, what's going on with Israel and the other countries there, the Islamic countries there. And there's both sides to it, right? I mean, they're just at war with each other, but they don't have a place in their heart for forgiveness. I think that's what's missing. So something we'll talk about more and more. But again, thank you, Akib Shabazz, for your comment. I do look forward to maybe having further discussions on this. But ultimately, what I said was, where do we go from here, right? I mean, which path are we gonna look? How does the Ishmael's path and how does Isaac from here? Where do we go? And I think that's ultimately, like, we can agree that some of the ways that Ishmael and Isaac can be viewed differently, sure. But ultimately, where do we go from here? And that's kind of what I think would be the focus moving forward, is Jacob and his line and the 10 Commandments and all these different reasons why I cling to that versus whatever other thing. And so just where am I seeing truth and where am I seeing God? It is down the path of Isaac, eventually to Jacob, and so forth. So something I'd be happy to have further discussions on. But thank you for your comment. All right, so we're going to get started with the Bible Companion series. This will be, starting again, chapter 28 through chapters 36 today. I would make sure you guys read those chapters, like I said, before we get started. So chapter 28, just to kind of get us oriented, this is roughly between 1800 and 1750 BC. We were in Beersheba, which is the southern part of Israel. I will just kind of start it off. I'll just read some verses just to get us started. But chapter 28, Isaac therefore called Jacob, greeted him with a blessing, and charged him, "You shall not marry a Canaanite woman. Go now to Padan Aram, to the house of your mother's father, Bethuel, and there choose a wife for yourself from among the daughters of your uncle Laban." And Padan Aram is quite a distance from Israel. This is like northeast of Israel. So these people are living in two different places. So I'll just continue. "May God Almighty bless you and make you fertile, multiply you, that you may become an assembly of peoples. May he extend to you and your descendants the blessing he gave to Abraham, so that you may gain possession of the land where you are staying, which he assigned to Abraham." So Isaac tells Jacob, he cannot marry a Canaanite woman. He doesn't want their idols and these false idols to make their way into his lineage, which is sort of like a constant fear and a constant struggle for the Israelite people. God doesn't want this either. So it's very much something that doesn't need to happen. He goes way up to Padan Aram, which is, remember, it's pretty far. This is where they went to get Rebecca from. So this is where Rebecca comes from, the Laban. She's Laban's brother, or she's Laban's sister, sorry. But Isaac gives Jacob another blessing, ultimately, and that's just, remember, God kind of continually reminded the covenant to Abraham. So Isaac's doing the same thing to Jacob, sort of hammering down this covenant and how important this is. And so then Isaac sent Jacob on his way. He went to Padan Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, the mother of Jacob and Esau. I'm going to pause here briefly. There is a movie that was done in 1994. It's about Jacob. I think it's called Jacob or something. It was done in the 90s. It's there's some big name people in this. Matthew Modine, who's from Full Metal Jacket, and probably might know him from Stranger Things. A very well-known face. You have Lara Flynn Boyle, who's a pretty big deal. And you have Sean Bean, who I used to always remember him as the bad guy in GoldenEye, which is one of the best, James Bond films ever. He's also in Lord of the Rings, but pretty well-known people in this movie. It's well done for the most part, but honestly, it's just not one of my favorites. There's some just weird moments in it that I would have liked to have seen done differently. I wouldn't recommend it on the same level like I would recommend His Only Son. It's a pretty good movie, guys. If you really wanted to just kind of immerse yourself into this time period, I think that it would serve a purpose. But ultimately, there's just so many things that I think are sort of inaccurately done that I don't really officially recommend it. I just kind of throwing it out there because I think it might be fun for some people if you wanted to do that. They threw some things in there, like Jacob is helping a kid at the beginning sort of rescue this kid. I don't I mean, they're sort of propping up Jacob's character, but it doesn't really change until later. Him like embodying God and following things that would resemble how God wants us to be. I mean, I just think they're sort of propping up Jacob a little bit. And then like someone from Esau's camp commandeers all of Jacob's stuff, which maybe that's in the Bible somewhere else, but I don't see that in what I covered. So I'm not so sure, guys. There's just some differences in there that, you know, it'd probably be a net positive if you want to watch it, just because it's, there's some things in there that are good, I think, but ultimately it's not one of my favorite, and it's not on my official recommendation list. So far, the only one I would probably officially recommend is his only son, but we'll kind of talk more about it. And a big part of what I do in these podcasts are going to be like covering certain Bible movies that I would recommend. And I recommend those to y'all because it's part of, like I said, immersing yourself, and it's sort of putting yourself there. I think movies are a great way to do that. So things like The Chosen and some of these things are going to have, I think, positive effects, especially if you're just kind of coming back into the faith and you want something that you can resonate with. And it's just something, it's more productive to watch that than whatever other thing. So, all right. Anyways, so Esau notices that Isaac had blessed Jacob while giving him the blessing. Also told him not to marry a Canaanite woman. And so notice that Isaac is very accepting of this, and I think he sort of snapped out of what led him into this position in the first place, which was his complacency and his unwillingness to recognize what God's call to Rebekah meant when God said that that the older would serve the younger. He kind of just acted blind to this, no pun intended, but ultimately I think now he really realizes it, and now he's fully on board. So he's giving him further blessings, and he's sort of giving him the exact address of where to go and making sure that Jacob is successful. So Esau, he saw Jacob obey. Esau probably realizes how much marrying all these Canaanite women that he had married before, how much that displeased his mother and father. You're supposed to honor your mother and father, and you have to understand that they sacrificed a lot for your life. Kind of speaking in general, not just in Jacob's case, or not just in Esau's case, but I mean, they literally gave us life, and there's no reason to ignore good advice that they would give you, and they have your best interest at heart. So I think Esau, that's a big problem with Esau, and that he didn't listen to his mother and father in that regard, and he was just so worried probably about these women and having these wives. So that's part of the reason why God, I think, knew that Jacob was going to be the one to carry on the covenant. But we need to respect that. We respect our parents' reasoning and any requests that they make of us, especially if it's in our own best interest. But so in verse 9, it says, in addition to the wives he had. So like I said, he didn't really know what it meant to carry on the covenant and to follow God, because in many cases, these people that he were marrying would not acknowledge God. And they had viewed the Canaanites as being cursed. So it's another part of this that we have to keep in mind. But what was so bad about the Canaanites, and why did they have this prejudice, which, like I mentioned earlier, it's just not something that I think a lot of people think about. Would it be possible to let the past go and try to unite as God's people? Which is, easier said than done. But if that were the case, changing the heart of Esau himself and all of his wives, if they could, ask God to forgive them, but that's just a way different time. We're so separated from that. But again, that's just something I'm just really navigating. Um, I'm sure it would, you know, that it'd be possible for them to do. But how do we know that this curse is even passed down in the first place? Because, like I said, Noah is still alive, right? So there's something out there with this curse that doesn't seem to be dead, So this is going to be hard to bypass this curse when Noah is still alive during Abraham's time. Noah could have held on to this thing until his last dying breath. We don't really know, but I would just imagine that Noah and his sons are still sort of letting that live out. So you could see this curse has like never ending consequences, and both Abraham and Isaac were worried that their wives were going to get killed. Plus, there's going to be future wars, so it creates a pretty hostile relationship, really. So Esau is now marrying into these people, and that's why they don't like it. And so he marries Mahalath. I think I'm saying that right. Mahalath. I might be butchering it. I have no idea. But who was actually the daughter of Ishmael. But it's in response to him hearing about his father, him hearing Isaac tell Jacob, "You don't need to marry a Canaanite woman." And so he kind of does this as a response. He marries a descendant of Ishmael. Okay. So Jacob leaves from Beersheba to Bethel, which is pretty close by, not very far really, but it's going towards the heart of Israel. And so there was some kind of shrine that he comes across, which was sort of a marker of like a sacred spot, where they might have had some type of arrangement of stones. Honestly, it's even possible that God maybe moved these stones, and people were just using them for all kind of things. But ultimately, God will have a purpose for this arrangement of stones, and I think it's to draw Jacob into this place. He used one of these stones as a pillow, which is interesting. We don't really think of using a stone as a pillow, but it is interesting that this could have been formed almost with this in mind. This whole scenery that Jacob's walking into might have been set up by God. And remember, God runs it all, so I wouldn't put that as something out of the realm of possibility. So he falls asleep and he's having a dream, and he sees this stairway to heaven, and God's messengers are going up and down it. I think of almost like a runway, and you see like all these all-stars, all these all-star God people of God. Whether some of them might have been like Elijah or whoever else, Moses or something, maybe, I don't know. But it's these these different messengers going up and down this thing. And so God tells Jacob the covenant right here. So I'll just go ahead and read some of it. And there was a Lord standing beside him, and I do think this is Christ that is giving this, that is telling him the covenant. I, the Lord, am the God of your forefather Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you are lying, I will give to you and your descendants. The land on which you are lying, I will give to you and your descendants. These shall be as plentiful as the dust of the earth, and through them you shall spread out east and west, north and south. In you and your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall find blessing. It says, and that's important because this is a prophecy of Christ. In you and your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall find blessing, which that absolutely happens. Through the Jewish people, we get Christ, and through that, all of the nations of the earth, including everyone, the Gentiles, anybody that had been separated, will eventually find blessing. So that's an important part of the Old Testament, and in seeing that prophecy play out. So He doesn't get this face to face necessarily like Abraham and Isaac. Sort of, he had this like live out in a more direct way. So what God's doing by coming to Jacob in a dream and giving him this message, Jacob really needs something from God, I think, at this point, like an interaction that he can really sort of build from in as far as his faith. And I think God using a dream is so efficient because he can use dreams even in our lifetime. I think of at least everybody probably has at least one or dreams that they can think back to where they wake up and they're like, something was trying to tell me something there. But in this case, and then God does this a lot, but he's using dreams in other cases like he did with Abimelech. But in this case, this is a big, important dream right here. So it's just a very cool interaction that Jacob is getting. And Jacob is immediately fired up about this. He goes on, he says, "How awesome is this shrine?" Talking about the stone he used for a pillow. Says it's an abode of God, which is like a place, God is in the spot. This is like this place or wherever he was, these arrangements of stones, he knows that God is there and is present in that place. Saying he's saying this, he thought this is where God lives and it was a gateway to heaven. And ultimately, right, it's all God's territory. He doesn't quite understand that yet. He doesn't realize, I guess, how all-powerful God really is, but he's starting to learn. And it's a big step in the direction as far as it's a big step in the right direction as far as his understanding of God. So even though, he doesn't realize God is like everywhere, but he is at least in this moment, he's understanding that God is in this place. So he poured oil on it, which is kind of weird. It's sort of almost like I feel like it's a pagan thing to do because it was a stone. But it was a stone that is connecting to God. So I'm going to say there's some symbology there with almost like anointing, like how Christ was anointed with oil, which was done before his crucifixion. And I think it was showing that it was something that was really important to be anointed with oil, to be kept like shiny and new. This was depicted very well in the Chosen series. And you didn't just waste oil on anything. It was a very hot commodity at the time, and I mean it still is sort of, but it's something that if they poured oil on something, it was an important thing to do. So and there's future symbology here because it's a stairway to heaven, and Christ is ultimately the pathway back to the Father. So this stairway is kind of how I think of that as almost like a stairway literally to heaven, but it is a stairway back to the Father. And Jacob makes this vow, and he's sort of bargaining with God here, which I'm thinking it's more of an ask. Kind of the same way the servant who went to find Rebecca sort of made an ask of God, like, God, can you do this for me? And I we'll go ahead and read it because it is important, but Jacob then made this vow: if God remains with me to protect me on this journey I am making, and to give me enough bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I come back safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. I'll finish it. This stone and I have set up as a memorial stone shall be God's abode. Of everything you give me, I will faithfully return a 10th part to you. So it's not the best look here, that he's bargaining with God. And it says he will give a 10th to God, which great. I mean, that's, again, it's a step in the right direction for sure. I mean, this reasoning probably came from Abraham and Melchizedek, which we referenced in episode 4. where Abraham had given a tenth of everything he owned to Melchizedek. So I think it's a step in the right direction. This might have been a little unorthodox, but that's God. I mean, he uses people that are not perfect. Remember, he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. I love that quote. But I think, as somebody that just didn't really have a relationship with God the way that Abraham did yet, or Abraham had went through this whole, there's multiple interactions with God. Well, this is the first time Jacob is sort of interacting with God. Jacob been so far we read about him, he was very deceitful in a lot of ways. And so he's sort of just now beginning. And I think it's our sort of, we go through that. A lot of us go through that where we want to ask God to protect us. And, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. It's sort of like saying, I'm scared, I'm out here, I'm doing my own thing, which was Jacob's case. And Jacob, is literally alone at this point, and he needs and wants God's protection. He also wants his presence. When he says that the Lord shall be my God, and that if he's with him, if God remains with me to protect me on this journey, so he wants God to be with him. Which, God's like, I'm going to be with you. If that's all it is, if God remains with me, God's like, yeah, I'm going to be with you. I don't have a problem answering that at all. Why? I mean, asking God to be with you is probably the easiest thing one of the easiest asks I think you can make. But just keep in mind, like, making an ask can be different than testing God, and it does sort to be a line that you can cross when you start making demands. You don't do ultimatums with God, and that's sort of what this comes across as, right? Like, if you do this, then I'll follow you. That's just something that you don't do, and I think that's why this is looked at like that, and I can understand that for sure, because you just don't do ultimatums with God. And remember, God doesn't need us. We need him. We don't have any leverage with God. So that's something we need to throw away. But I think ultimately, if you do that as a non-believer, it is a first step, and it is a good first step to take. It's an important first step. A lot of people probably get to a point where they're desperate and they want something from God. And so the more you read about it and the more you understand into that sort of first ask that a lot of people make, it can come across as a saving moment for a lot of people. But as you go through your journey, just know, like, this miracle that you might be asking for, or this demand you might be making almost, is not going to give you as much fulfillment as actually reading the Word of God and keeping the commandments and working hard. I mean, that is really truly going to supply you with everything you need. And we have this gift of eternal life. So anything that happens to our earthly bodies is not an indication of what God wants for us necessarily. So just because maybe that big ask that you're making, God, if you do this for me, I'll follow you. If that doesn't get answered, just know that doesn't mean that you cannot be you cannot live eternal through Christ, and have a different ask answered, which is always going to be answered for you, is, can you be in the family of God? If you said, God, I want to be in the family with you. I want to be a part of your holy lineage, I guess, in a way that you could kind of think about it. I want to be with you, and I want you in my life. Then that's going to be answered, and that's the important ask to make, not some external thing. God, if I can make enough money this year to buy a house or whatever, I'll follow you. I would urge you not to do that. But if that's the first step that you just want to make, I mean, it might have, it could work out well, and God might be using that. There's no right or there's no black and white answer to that. It's a gray area. And okay, that was a long chapter. There was a lot to cover in there. But I'll go ahead and get into chapter 29. So after Jacob resumed his journey, so he left Bethel. And so after Jacob resumed his journey, he came to the land of the Easterners, which were kind of just generically known as Easterners, also known as the Canaanites. And it's just a kind of a general designation for the people living on like the eastern border of Syria and Palestine, from as far north as Haran to as far south as like the northern sea or the northern end of the Red Sea. So he comes across this well. Let me go ahead and just finish reading through it. Looking about, he saw a well in the open country with 3 droves of sheep huddled near it, for droves were watered from that well. So this is what they were using this well to water their flock. A large stone covered the mouth of the well. Only when all the shepherds were assembled there could they roll the stone away from the mouth of the well and water the flocks. Then they would put the stone back again over the mouth of the well. So he comes across this well, which was typically more of like a hole in the ground. It wasn't like the nice, like stacked up sort of round thing that we think about. It didn't have like the clean sort of circular border that we think of. But it was this big stone that was covering it. And I think you would need like multiple shepherds on a normal basis to like pull this thing away, is sort of what this is implying. But Jacob sees all the other shepherds there, and they're all gathered there. Jacob is really a good shepherd. And I don't mean that like in the good shepherd sort of symbolic sort of way. I mean, like, he is literally a good shepherd, which I'm gonna have to pause and do a little soapbox on this. Sorry. But this whole concept of herding flock and sheep is actually a big talking point. It alludes to the same way, God shepherds us. You just have to look at the sort of biological understanding of the higher life form that is going to supply life and be able to condition the flock for the best life. And that's exactly what a good shepherd would do. And that is exactly what God does for us. He nurtures us, and he gives us the best life that we can have. So this whole concept of being a good shepherd, it alludes to the same way God shepherds us. So we are shepherding flock and taking care of them, nurturing them, not abusing them, but setting them up for the best chance of a healthy life is exactly what made these shepherds successful. And there's a divine-like nature, really interesting part, by which these like early patriarchs are able to sort of harness this power where they can, where these animals are just really, it's actually a pretty cool thing to see. But like many times we will see, they're able to multiply their flock like exponentially. And it's a really, really cool, like superpower almost that they have, when we think back to having dominion over the animals. In a way, they're almost like can fully control these animals. So they have this like Aquaman sort of almost superpower in a way, with these flock, that they're able to nurture them in the best way possible that allows for them to exponentially grow. And it was what separated them from other cultures, and we see that play out right here. But we'll read about why that, or some things that back up that. But there's an obvious connection too between priests and pastors that are shepherding the flock, and it applies to the head of the church and the family, and Christ, who shepherds us, who is ultimately above it all, who is the ultimate good shepherd. And we kind of already went through the biological sort of parallel that we have there with humans are, what we are to sheep is sort of like God would be to us. So we have to understand that sort of next life form up. There's a great metaphor in John chapter 10, which I am going to go ahead and read that. I don't want to get so far bogged down in it. I don't like skipping forward, and I'm not going to do that too much to you guys, but this part of it's important, because when we read about these shepherds in the Old Testament or anywhere in here, we need to understand like that is a continual part of what the Bible is trying to teach us. So I'm going to just sort of read out of John chapter 10. Amen, amen, I say to you, whoever does not enter a sheepfold through the gate, but climbs over elsewhere, is a thief and a robber. But whoever enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice as he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. So Jesus is not talking about sheep right here. He is talking about him. He's referring to himself as a shepherd of the sheep, and his followers as the ones that are being called by name. When he had driven out all of his own, he walks out ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. But they will not follow a stranger. They will run away from him because they do not recognize the voice of strangers. Although Jesus used this figure of speech, they did not realize what he was trying to tell them. So Jesus said again, amen, amen, I say to you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. A thief only comes to steal and slaughter and destroy. I came so they might have life and have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. A good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. A hired man who is not a shepherd and whose sheep are not of his own sees a wolf coming and leaves the sheep and runs away, and the wolf catches and scatters them. This is because he works for pay and has no concern for sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me. That's important. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I will lay down my life for the sheep. So when we think about being the good shepherd that he is, laying down his life for us, and everything that our society has built up, or that our society has done since he came and since he set that example, has God been a good shepherd to us? Let's think about if we can see truth in that statement. Because everything Christ just said there, it's so indicative of the former leadership that Israel had, where people were doing it for all these different reasons, some other external reason that they had, that they wanted to be in this position of power. Whereas he came down and he was like, no, I truly want what's best for my people. And we have to think about, what happened since Christ has left. What did he prove to be the good shepherd? Well, I think we ignore a lot of evidence that would pretty much indicate that, yes, he came down and he set up an amazing life for us. And Christians, and following his example, have set up an amazing life for all of us. Hospitals, charities, universities, all these things are Christian founded, and you can go research into it. Go be my guest. And all these things have, doubled our lifespan, obviously. A lot of these different things, universities, a combination of universities and hospitals and charities really, have advanced medical care in a different way that we wouldn't have even known possible probably 1,000 years ago. But we started learning, we started really, it took some time, and it kind of itself has evolved over time. And there's Christians that were, doing terrible things, yes. But ultimately, let's think about the net positive or the net negative that would have resulted. And it's just obviously a completely different world that we live in. I mean, we have running water, indoor plumbing, all these medical advances. And I mean, science gets so much credit for these things, which I just find hilarious because, I mean, most of what America was founded on was, and the West, all of what we think about in the West, was founded on was Christian virtues. And science is just sort of a tool, but what is really driving society is caring for the well-being and health of others, which this whole concept of healthcare, and we kind of feel like we're entitled to healthcare, and that's sort of interesting if you start thinking about the history of healthcare. But this wasn't offered it wasn't offered to humanity until like the late 1800s, in like the early 1900s by Western countries, which healthcare is exactly what Christ himself came down to be, or one of the things he came down to be was a healer, not just of the body, but of the mind and soul as well. And so he was sort of the original, I mean, doctor, I guess, or, you know, the most successful doctor that there could be. But then you have guys like Luke, who was a physician and a healer, and you just see how we get healed. And I mean, we can go look at the history of public hospitals. The only hospital that matches this description of like a continuous, or the one that is like a continual operating hospital, was established in the 7th century by Saint Landry, which is the Hotel Dieu in Paris. And so the official records do not begin for the hospital until like 829 AD, but this is considered the oldest continuously working hospital in the world. I'm going to go ahead and make a pretty bold assertion that hospitals are a Christian concept. And I mean, you can go look at whatever other source, you know, there's secular sources, even just like Wikipedia. I'll read right from Wikipedia, but public hospitals per se did not exist until the Christian period. Toward the end of the 4th century, the Second Medical Revolution took place, with the founding of the first Christian hospital in the Eastern Byzantine Empire. And then, I mean, you could just go down that rabbit hole if you want, but, you know, if some skeptic or somebody that is challenging that hospitals didn't come into society as a Christian idea, you have a lot of work to do. Y'all need to try to get that corrected, I guess, on Wikipedia, but yeah, I don't think there's going to be much contention from anybody. So, I mean, that's a big part of, I think a lot of people overlook that. There's other archaeological evidence up there of like hospitals and other societies. But I mean, it's just not as obvious as a proof of something that has been existing and operating for 1,000 years. That's going to be a lot more persuasive than some archaeological discovery that it might have been a public hospital, but it could have just been for royalty. So there's a difference there. And it's like, yes, you can care for royalty, sure, but you know, was it really helping the public? And I mean, just think of the names of our hospitals, you know, Methodist Hospital, Red Cross, Blue Cross, all these different things. I was talking with Pastor Tyler about that, but yeah, it's just, it's an interesting part of our society in which we think about the Good Shepherd is like, he came down and he really made it, I mean, it made an everlasting difference with us and how we take care of each other. And we have set up this comfort society that we live in now, and I think we take it for granted. So yes, he is a good shepherd. I mean, just look at the evidence around you. This covenant with Abraham definitely played out, and we have millions of billions of people who descended from Abraham and who are blessed through him, just like it says. More evidence of, you know, the whole prophecy coming true, finding blessings through the line of Israel. Our cups runneth over in our days. I mean, literally, I'm talking about like water. Our cups truly do runneth over. We have hospitals in all these all these awesome conveniences. And it's just hilarious to me that science gets all the credit for it. When, up till about 50 years ago, it was Christians that spearheaded all this into existence. Science itself is a Christian idea, the pursuit of truth, right? So, all right, end of soapbox. So just to recap, Jacob, who's a good shepherd, is encountering these men way north of Beersheba on his quest to join Laban. That was a command given to him by Isaac. He needs to find a wife in this place. So he comes across them. He comes across these other shepherds, and he says, "Friends, where are you from?" "We are from Haran." And they replied. Then he asked, "We are from Haran." They replied. Then he asked, "Do you know Laban, son of Nahor?" "We do," they answered. He inquired further, "Is he well?" "He is," they answered, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with his flock." Then he said, "There is still much daylight left. It is hardly the time to bring the animals home. Why don't you water the flocks now and then continue pasturing them?" "We cannot," they replied, "until all the shepherds are here to roll the stone away from the mouth of the well. Only then can we water the flocks." There's more going on here than just this sort of like disagreement. And so it's a very sort of cordial conversation, but underneath it is, Jacob knows that they're not really doing the right thing. There is still a lot of daylight, and so it's hardly the time for the animals to bring the animals home, because they still need to be out there eating and just and existing in their sheepness. But so right now, what the shepherds are trying to do is just like keep them in one spot, and they can't really roam and do what they need to do, because it's benefiting them if they do this all at the same time. So he's basically kind of telling these guys sort of how to do their job. Why don't you water the flocks now? Because it's still earlier in the day. Why don't you water them now, and then they can have the whole day to finish pasturing them, or really like feeding them. So they're sort of keeping these animals, like they're keeping them from the best chance of having a healthy life in a way. So you can kind of think about it. They're just kind of doing sort of the lazy thing. And I had to kind of research into that to get to that part of understanding what's happening here in this sort of disagreement, and why he says, "There is still much daylight left. It is hardly the time to bring the animals home. Why don't you water the flocks now and then continue pasturing them?" Which is what you should be doing. And he knows that because he is a talented shepherd. So he's telling them basically, like, instead of gathering them also early in the day, they should be out in the field, scattered amongst the vegetation. And so while the shepherd is supposed to look after them, and they are trying to do what's easiest and most efficient for them, instead of being sacrificial to get a better result, or sacrificing, like they're going to have to work harder to get that done, but it's what's best for the animals. It's very kind of a pagan thing to do, I think, for them, and sort of like controlling the water and having this be like the way that they're doing it is they're sort of gathering them all up in one place and then having it sort of be an event. Like, I'm gonna sort of be a lord over all the animals, and they're gonna see that I control the water, which is just kind of a selfish thing to do, because these animals are probably thirsty. They're probably ready to drink and then get about their day. But Jacob is just a lot more analytical about the health of these animals, and it's sort of like this ingrained, almost sort of superpower that he has. And so, I mean, he does like what a lot of guys do. He steps in and is like, "Yeah, I know how to do this, and you're doing it wrong." And guys do it all the time. It's not necessarily a bad thing. He might have a point, and he actually has the correct procedure by which to do these things. And in time, they will learn from Jacob and all the different things he's able to do with the flocks. But for now, they refuse. I mean, they just met the guy. So And then especially now that he's expecting this woman to show up, which is the whole reason he's going over there. It could be his potential wife. He is in show off mode. And guys also, fall into this when, they're going to try to, show that they're correct. If people are discussing, I don't care what it is, lawnmowers or how to fix a toilet or whatever other thing, they're going to try to put their 2 cents in and make it look like they're more knowledgeable. It's just a part of the competition that guys have. And so now she shows up. Rachel shows up, and as soon as he saw her, he goes and just rolls the stone away by himself, which was definitely a show off move, right? Like normally you'd have to have all these men to do it, and he's just like, I'm gonna do it myself. And he's like the modern day version of like carrying all the groceries into the house. So I think that's kind of what's happening. And then I guess he's just at this point unable to stop himself, and he just kisses her and bursts into tears. Like very sort of dramatic, over the top display by Jacob. And I don't know. I guess Rachel was vibing this though, because she's definitely into Jacob the rest of the story. So I think just a very passionate Jacob here just sees her, does this show off move, goes over, kisses her, cries. Just doing the most. Just literally doing the most. Anyways, so Laban hears about him coming into town, and he comes out. Laban kisses Jacob. Like, guys, like, calm down with all the kissing. And so Jacob told Laban about everything that happened. I'm assuming like the whole birthright situation. Probably went through a lot of it. And Laban goes, "You are indeed flesh of my blood." Like, yeah, I can see where you get that from. Having Rebecca be your mom, and we'll know, we'll get to see that Laban is full of tricks himself. So he's like, "Yeah, you are indeed flesh of my blood." So Jacob was now with his family for a whole month. And he's living in this place, and he just assumed that he's going to serve Laban, which is a very interesting thing that this culture did, or these early group of these people of God, that's what they did, is they served before they expected anything, which is I think that's skipped over, and it's skipped over as far as we should recognize when we see somebody, like when we see this. He is doing it for his best interest, but he's doing it the right way in pursuing this woman and courting her. It's done in the right way here. Yeah, he was a little upfront with the kiss, but this is like 4,000 years ago, so I'll give him a little grace on that. But so remember, he seems to know more about keeping the flocks. So he is going to be effective and useful to Laban. And so Laban is probably seeing this already. But he had been serving him for a full month. And Jacob being so good at, having this talent of being able to take care of the flock. He's going to sort of leverage that, I think, and use that to gain favor. But Laban's like, you've been working for a month. I know you're not doing this for free. So how am I supposed to pay you? So then this is when it's brought up. And we learn about Rachel and Leah. Rachel was very beautiful and well-formed, it says. Leah has weak eyes. And also in other translations, it says that she has lovely eyes. But I think what it really means, I guess the combination of those two would be like soft eyes. It's just giving like not the main character energy, sort of, is how I think you would read that. Is like you read it and you're like, okay, Leah was living sort of in the shadows of her sister a little bit, and you can kind of read it like that. Whether it's weak or lovely, it's how it kind of comes across. Um, and so Jacob says he's going to serve Laban for 7 years for Rachel. He sort of makes this, he starts the negotiating there, which he's better than me. I mean, I would have started at the bottom. Like, oh, hey, I already worked for you for a month. Do you think that's good enough? Like, can I go ahead and can I ask for your daughter? So maybe he's just being generous, or maybe he knows, it's like when you're I'm reading this like in the eyes of a negotiator or a sales guy, sort of, and I was just like, man, you really came with it. Like, I mean, anyways, but maybe he's being generous, or maybe he knows he needs to bring something stronger to the table up front, and that is another negotiating tactic too, where he could have started like low, and then that might have just made him seem like he's just trying to get this for free, kind of. But I mean, 7 years is a long time to serve someone for 7 years. But Laban responds to this and says, like, hey, I'd rather an outsider. I'd rather you than an outsider. I'd rather you marry my daughter than have an outsider do it. So stay with me is what he says, which is for me kind of saying like he is down to honor that arrangement. Obviously, is what comes from that. So he did it. He says the 7 years passed pretty quickly to him. He was excited to marry Rachel. So the time, I guess, didn't really seem like it went as long. And then Jacob says to Laban, like pretty abruptly, it's time for me to consummate the marriage with your daughter. And Laban's like, whoa, dude, just hang on for a second. Like, that's, it is 7 years. And Jacob's like, let's get on with it. They're using some different verbiage. I'm not going to sometimes read right out of the Bible, so just keep that in mind. But you can get it. Like Laban or Jacob is excited to start his marriage life with Rachel, and he sort of abruptly tells Laban this. But you can tell Jacob is eager, and Laban invites him or invites all the inhabitants in this place for this grace, for this big feast and this big marriage event that they're going to have. And very, I'm sure you guys probably are aware of this story, but if you're not, we're going to still go through it. But at nightfall, he got Leah and brought her to Jacob. Now, in the movie sort of portrays this, I think, sort of, or the part as far as like dressing, she was probably dressed up in something, and that's probably, I could see that happening. But what I think happened really is, I think why Jacob was able to just not recognize it was Leah instead of Rachel, I think he got liquored up, honestly. And anything beyond that, I don't see how it's possible that somebody could have just not realized that somebody was a different person than the person they're supposed to be marrying. I mean, how else did you not recognize that? But I think sort of stereotypically he was drinking a lot, or at least had a few drinks, and had just sort of not really that coherent. I think that's how that could have happened. I think at the very least he was maybe a little tipsy. You've got Laban, who is a pagan. He's probably mixing up these potions and these alcoholic drinks. I don't know. That's just an opinion. It's based on nothing. It's based purely on my hunch that I have that Jacob was drunk, and or not drunk. I don't want to say that, but Jacob was just under the influence, because how could he not have been? Which is totally acceptable for someone in their wedding, to have a few drinks. And Laban might have spiked him, I don't know. But how could you not realize that somebody was different than, I don't know. But anyways, so Jacob consummated the marriage, and here we go. What comes around goes around, right? Jacob met his match in Laban, the trickster, which I think Jacob honestly sort of needed a humbling at some point, and I think it makes sense for why this happens. It also mentioned that Leah had a servant girl who was going to serve her that was given to her by her father. Again, this is a pagan sort of a concept. And Christ really has to come in and fix this whole like multiple wives, concubine sort of setup that these people just are inclined to having. But at the same time, I mean, for this time period, the reproductive results were also very important. So, and they need to grow at a fast rate to protect themselves. And I think God, knows that. And the rate at which God develops these people is all for a reason. So, we're going to see this play out, but there's going to be a multiple wife sort of situation. Polygamous sort of relationship in the beginning. So he wakes up in the morning, probably hungover. Again, it's my opinion, and this the hill I'll fight you on. And he's like, "Who's this? This isn't Rachel. This is Leah." And he says to Laban, "How could you dupe me? Why did you dupe me?" This is probably an insane sort of jaw-dropping moment for him, that he woke up and it's a different woman than he thought was going to be married. He says, like, "I served you for 7 years. Like, how could you do this to me?" And Laban's whole reasoning, which is just like, it's not the custom to marry off the younger daughter before the older one. So Leah was the older daughter. And he definitely never mentioned this to Jacob. This is just his reasoning. And Laban tries to offer a solution. He says, just finish off the bridal week with Leah. And a quick thing, that this whole thing is just not fair to both of these girls, honestly. Rachel really likes Jacob, and Leah is probably being influenced by her dad on this stuff. And he's just sort of orchestrating this lie for her. So, it's just not fair to both of them. It's going to create a lot of hostilities. So anyways, and this whole thing with the bridal week, and it's like Laban's sort of saying, like, just give her this, like, she at least deserves this, which she does. I mean, Leah doesn't really, I wouldn't say like she deserves it though, but I mean, she's in this position, and this is what it is now, and she at least needs to be, if she is getting married, like, I would hate for her to have this terrible experience where she's just being rejected. And that's kind of what Laban is saying, like, can you just be with her for this week? Anyways, so, and then he also offers, he's like, if you serve another 7 years, you can have Rachel. And Jacob's just probably like, sure, like, he didn't really have a choice. So he just complies and does the 7 years. And then he marries Rachel. So he serves another 7 years. That's 14 years. It's a long time. I mean, it's a long time. But he does it. And it says he loved Rachel more than Leah. Which Leah just must have been suffering in a major way for this whole dynamic. And that's why this polygamous relationship, any culture that just welcomes polygamy, I mean, I don't see how, like, anybody looking at Mormonism or the Islamic religion and just can't see an issue with that. I mean, it's just not fair to these women. But regardless, so Leah is really not getting a fair marriage here. She's probably feels like a third wheel, a weird sort of a third wheel situation. And this whole setup, again, it's not God's design for marriage. And Christ comes down and he corrects that. And again, just because we see it in the Bible doesn't mean it's God's design. And people hold on to everything in the Bible as being an example. And that's not actually, I'd probably say there's more examples of what not to do in the Bible than of what to do. That's probably a pretty true statement, especially in the Old Testament. There's more examples of what not to do, and we confuse that as being God's plan and God's design. That's what a lot of people, they read the Bible like this. That's how you get so many people that think God was a proponent of slavery and all these other things, and it's reading it entirely incorrectly, as far as the Christian understanding of the Bible. So Christ will come in and he'll correct these things, and he'll correct marriage, and how we do marriage. But God sees Leah's suffering, and won't he do it? Because he sure will. God blessed Leah, who was unloved, while Rachel remained barren. And it's interesting that God does this. He's there for everyone, and it's showing that you don't have to let the hate and the unfair treatment of the world dissuade you from God, because God will show up for you, even if you feel unloved. And honestly, what would have been probably a good setup would have been Esau and Jacob going to Padan Aram, Jacob marrying Rachel, and Esau marrying Leah. I mean, that's probably what really should have happened. Just an interesting side note that I just think it's interesting the family didn't go that route, but Esau it wasn't going to happen like that, because Esau from the beginning wasn't going to do things the right way. So God blesses Leah, and God is giving her the ability to have children. And it's both humbling for Rachel, and it's also empowering Leah. So it's just a balance that's going to happen. God also recognizes that Rachel's not really getting, Rachel wanted to marry, Rachel had this trick. This trick affected Rachel in a major way too, but that'll come later. But right now, God is empowering Leah, and the first son of the 12 tribes of Israel, which is going to birth the Israelites. It's going to start the Israelites. This is where we see this starting. So the first son is Reuben, and which means the Lord saw my misery, and now my husband will love me. Like a more direct translation is like, he will love me, or he saw my misery. So that's where Reuben kind of comes from. And then she had Simon. I was unloved. He has given me this one also. He heard is another sort of a meaning out of Simeon. Sorry, not Simon, Simeon. Then you have Levi, who's the third son. My husband might love me now that I have had 3 sons. He will become attached. Anytime you have a child with someone, I mean, there's an attachment there for the rest of your life that you just can't ignore. And I think she's realizing, like, okay, he's starting to really grow with me now. This family is growing, they're growing together. Judah is the 4th son. Very important to track this. I will give grateful praise to the Lord. This is important because this is the line, the Messiah comes from. This is going to come up later in the Bible. And then she stopped bearing children for some time. But, we just have to take away from that Leah showed grit and determination. And she's kind of like Jacob, really. There's a pretty strong connection between Jacob and Leah. She wasn't really favored, neither was Jacob. Jacob wasn't favored by Isaac. And Isaac favored Esau, just like Jacob is favoring Rachel. And then they both pretend to be someone else in order to exalt themselves through this deception, which is exactly what Jacob did with the birthright and putting on the hairy arms and stuff. And it's the same thing that Leah is doing by pretending to be Rachel, even though that was probably more of her father's doing, but it was also Jacob's mother's doing. So these people are like, Jacob and Leah are actually very similar people. And it's interesting that they will have, a lot more. They're gonna be responsible for many of the descendants. Okay, so that was chapter 29. Now let's get into chapter 30. Rachel is very troubled, not being able to have children. It's the same thing Sarah and Rebecca went through. These women that were beautiful, that they were, Yeah, like Abraham saw Sarah, and the same way Isaac saw Rebecca, and I mean they were beautiful women, but it's just something about that. Um, and God is making, I think, through that, through them being barren, and then the sons they ultimately have, I think there's something special grows out of that, and these children are a lot more, I think, appreciated. And I think there's a sort of a reason why this keeps happening, but and her troubles are on more display than the other early matriarchal figures. So what I mean is, like, Sarah and Rebecca, they had issues, but as far as like taking that up with, and Sarah, I mean, at the same time, Sarah, yeah, she this was kind of on full display as far as like what her problems were and them being recorded and her accounts being recorded. But in Rebecca, there's not much there. But I mean, Rachel's problems are going to be on full display for us here, and it's a test of faith. You know, as you read through this, you'll kind of see this back and forth with Rachel, and they're both frustrated. You know, um, but it's, there's a struggle here, but what comes out of it is more of a blessing. And remember, these people, there's a lot of tribe to have children. It's just that was what sort of determined whether you were blessed or cursed in the ancient world, is if you could have children. So it's a very stressful time right now. But there's an exchange of words here, and she says, "Give me children or I will die." And Jacob's like, "What do you want me to do?" It's like, look, it must be God doing this. And in a way, it is calling Rachel to be aware that she needs the blessing from the one true God, and not any kind of false idol that Laban's family has been worshiping. And it's not very nice what the way that Jacob tells Rachel this, but he kind of tells her like it is, honestly, right here. And I don't necessarily see that much of a problem with it, especially if Rachel is maybe holding on to these other gods. But I think it is sort of alluding to the fact that Rachel needs to ask God for the blessing, and because Jacob says, "Can I take the place of God, who has denied you the fruit of the womb?" Which is, God. Jacob is putting it on God at this point. Didn't necessarily know if Rachel was praying about it. So, anyways, so she offers up her servant girl as a solution, which is the same sort of thing that we saw with Sarah, and it's how Ishmael came into being, and which is the same move, or sorry, I've already mentioned that, but it's the same thing that happened in many other cultures, and just you can only assume. But I don't really assume anything on this show, so I did kind of go look into concubinage. It's sort of like how that happened and if it was a widespread thing, and it definitely was. The Ottoman Empire and this whole aspect of kind of control for power. Even thinking about like Henry VIII, like it doesn't really necessarily stop. Even into Christian societies, there was this need to do whatever it took to reproduce, and if it meant disobeying God's commands, like they would do it anyways. So it really does take Christ to correct this. But so we don't follow Jacob and Laban, we follow Christ, and what Christ says is to keep it clean. He really dismantles this fear that we just have to reproduce, and that's what's the only thing that's giving us any value is our reproduction. These people are living in fear that they need to reproduce for their legacy, and in Christ we know that we are born again and to be welcomed into His kingdom, which outweighs this like earthly obsession of needing like multiple wives to begin with. Genesis has a lot of like strong biological sort of like survival of the fittest undertone that humans kind of fall into, and we will see these problems that arise from that. They don't get fixed until Christ comes. So even though, like, maybe Darwin or someone came in and like gave it a label of survival of the fittest, I mean, that's already ingrained in any type of animal, that we have to reproduce, and I have to pass down my legacy into the next. And if that doesn't happen, then it's just the end of the world. And Christ comes in and it takes that fear away, because we live with that sort of biological lizard brain type fear of that. And the only way to, I mean, you could have there could be some other type of understanding that bypasses it through some other thing, but Christ, going through Christ, it really does take away that fear, because we understand that this world is just temporary, and this is not something that is going to make or break our soul. So even though it's a commandment, we be fruitful and multiply, and we have a family, and we do all these things, it's not going to cause us to sin or do all these crazy things just to make that happen, which we kind of see this happening here. But again, this is a different time period, and it's part of God's plan ultimately. Anyways, they have a child together. So the slave woman and or the servant girl, I think that sounds better. The servant girl and Jacob have a child together. His name is Dan. And you could see how these women are being made to be into the family of God. So this is very much being used for good in a lot of ways. There was another one born. His name was Naphtali, which meant, in a divine wrestling match I have wrestled, which is sort of a foreshadowing. We're about to read some more about wrestling. But it also says it means I engage in a fateful struggle with my sister and I have prevailed. So for whatever reason, Rachel is thinking that she won somehow because Jacob had 2 kids with her servant girl. Sure, Rachel, congratulations. Like, I don't know. I think deep down, Rachel still, doesn't really feel like she won anything. So now Leah sees this and she needs to get back at Rachel. I don't know if I keep saying Leah. It might be Leah. I don't think there's really a difference. So forgive me if I'm wrong. I'm not really great with names, but anyways. So apparently she can't have kids at this moment. She had just had 4 sons. And so for a reason, she couldn't have kids. And so she gives her servant girl now to Jacob. And they have 2 kids. He has 2 sons with her maidservant Zilpah. And they have Gad and Asher, now the 7th and 8th sons. So Jacob is really putting in some work, and that's all we'll say about that. But in reality, we're about to read into some other, honestly, kind of some raunchy stuff, guys, just being honest with you. But it's what makes the Bible interesting, to say the least. Not even really sure if we should read some of this, to be honest, but it's pretty funny. I mean, we see things working in this family in the way that this is happening, but that it's unconventional the way these things are happening in this family, but it's just the kind of stuff that I guess you get when you have this polygamous sort of setup. But so Rachel sees these mandrakes that Leah has, and I guess they were some good mandrakes. Ultimately, though, the reason why she really wants these mandrakes is because they were believed to be a stimulant to help with infertility and to be able to provide conception for barren women. So understanding that makes a lot more sense. But anyways, she really wanted the mandrakes, and when it comes to snacks, I mean, we'll do just about anything for some good snacks. So Leah says, was it not enough to take my husband, but now you have to take my mandrakes too? And if I was Rachel, I'd be like, okay, first off, you had to trick my husband into marrying you. and you stole him to begin with. So that would have been my little clap back. But she doesn't say that. And this whole chapter is giving soap drama for sure. But Rachel pretty much says, Rachel agrees. Like, okay, so I'm gonna find it so I can kind of get it word for word. But so was it not enough for you to take away my husband, that you must now take my son's mandrakes too? Very well then, Rachel answered, in exchange for your son's mandrakes, Jacob may lie with you tonight. So Rachel gives up her husband for this trade, which, again, pretty raunchy thing to do, I guess, here. She's sort of like selling Jacob, and she's kind of studying Jacob out here for some product, I guess you could think about it like that. Like a stud fee sort of, but Jacob, so she sells Jacob for the mandrakes. It seems silly, but I mean, Esau sort of did the same thing with the stew, right? It's just these, food was a lot more important to these people than we sort of think about food. And we kind of joke, and I kind of would joke about how this food was so important, and don't underestimate the power of snacks. But I mean, the reality is, like, they need to learn to fast, or they need to learn to not put so much emphasis on some temporary solution. And maybe she really just needed the mandrakes for like a health benefit in order to try to have children. But anyways, she sells Jacob for the mandrakes, and Leah gets pregnant again because of this. And she has Issachar, which is my reward. So this is now the sixth son just to Leah. And she also has a daughter, which we'll read about later, Dinah, who's the little sister, who's going to come up again later in this podcast, and she's very important to the story. But Leah has 7 kids total, which, wow. So sorry, there was actually, so she has 2 sons out of this. So she has Issachar and Zebulun. Zebulun, I think, means the bridegroom gift. And Issachar means my reward. So out of this whole mandrake thing, this weird thing with the mandrakes, Rachel sells these mandrakes away, and Leah, and ultimately, Leah benefits out of it. So at the very end of all this, God comes through for Rachel, and I was not going to forget Rachel, and it literally says that. Then God remembered Rachel. He heard her prayer, so she prayed to him. And I think that it might have took some time for her to get to there. And he made her fruitful. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has removed my disgrace. So she named him Joseph, meaning, may the Lord add another son to this one for me. So we now have Joseph. Wow, Joseph is going to be a huge figure in this whole thing. He's the 10th son. Just a very important thing that happened. So wow, like this is really cool. Sorry, the 11th son. If I said 10th, I meant the 11th. But this is just a really cool thing that happens here. Again, we already had Sarah and Rebecca have their prayers answered, and now Rachel has her prayers answered. But you have to feel for Rachel. I mean, her and Jacob were in love, and this evil thing happened with this trick, and it's sort of overlooked, but God did not forget her. So Jacob has 11 kids at this point, and he's starting to have a clan of people. under his guidance. I mean, we're seeing this is becoming a tribe, and this is becoming more than what we had previous when it was just Noah, or it was just Noah and his sons, or Abraham and his son, or sons. And so another thing too about Abraham, real quickly, and having, he does have multiple sons. We always think about him and his only son. I mean, the reality is he has other sons. So that part of it too is something I'm sort of navigating through. But anyways, so Jacob wants to leave at this point. He has this whole clan of people under his guidance, all these sons. He kind of wants to do his own thing, and he needs to. He knows that God's will wants him back in the land that he was promised. Give me leave to go to my homeland, is what he says. He's like, I've serviced you, talking to Laban. Give me leave to go to my homeland. I've serviced you. He had made Laban very rich, not just in livestock, which is important, but I mean, grandchildren, like he had given him a lot, 20 years of service, basically. And Laban admits something here, and he sort of starts recognizing God. So we'll just pick it up at verse 27. Laban answered him, I will, if you will, please. I have learned through divination that it is because of you that God has blessed me. Interesting. So Laban is being blessed through the presence of Jacob. Jacob's able to have all these flocks, be very successful with him, probably other animals, or whatever other animals it was. All of his different flocks had grown, and Laban is sort of accumulating all this wealth out of this. And I think this is kind of a first step with Laban, and maybe, in recognizing and following God, is at least recognizing the blessings that Jacob is getting. In the same way that Abimelech and the king of the Hittites could recognize God, Laban can recognize God here. So I'll just kind of read a little bit about what happens. But ultimately, we're going to see this thing play out with these. What Jacob does something that makes sense for him and benefits him, but it's just another one of the tricks. So let me read a little bit about what happens. So they go back and forth. First off, before I read into it, they kind of go back and forth, and they're trying to figure out, what are the terms in which Jacob's going to leave. And Jacob says, the work I did for you, how well your livestock fared under my care. The little you had before I came has grown into very much. So when he got there, he didn't have a lot, and now Laban has all this stuff. Since the Lord's blessings came upon you in my company, therefore I should now do something for my own household as well. What should I pay you? Laban asked. Jacob answered, you do not have to pay me anything outright. I will again pasture and tend your flock if you do this one thing for me. Go through your whole flock today and remove from it every dark animal among the sheep and every spotted or speckled one among the goats. Only such animals shall be my wages. In the future, whenever you check on these wages of mine, let the honesty testify against me. Any animal in my possession that is not a speckled or spotted goat or a dark sheep got there by theft. Very well, Laban agreed. Let it be as you say. So he wants these certain types of goats, and he knows that God is going to be on his side in order to make this happen. And I think having these like supernatural powers, I think that's kind of overlooked a little bit in reading through some of this. But I think, Jacob understood that God couldn't control the livestock. Remember, that was one of the first things that God gave humanity, was the ability to have dominion over the animals. Dominion doesn't just mean I can kill the animals. Dominion for this means in a way that that they can sort of manipulate and be able to produce these animals, or these animals being able to reproduce in a way that is beneficial to them. It's just got a supernatural sort of undertone. This whole portion of this interaction has a supernatural undertone. And so, and even think about, we can create all kinds of different types of dogs, and we have this ability to do this that no other animal can. And so we have this sort of power over these animals. But I think the power that Jacob has and the power that the early patriarchs have with these flocks are even different than the power that we have and all the tools that we have. So anyways, so now we have this battle of wits between Laban and Jacob, two tricksters that are going at it. Laban does the obvious thing, and that his sons remove all the goats that were going to be dedicated to Jacob. And so he kind of takes the bait in a way, and he left them in charge of his sons, and Laban takes off and says there's going to be a 3-day journey between both of them, between Laban and Jacob. So that's pretty far. So, and this whole part of what Jacob does here is pretty confusing. If you read this and were like not really sure what the rods were and all this, I'm going to try to clear it up, and that's why we do the podcast. Basically, Jacob uses some rods that were set upright in the watering trough, which I think of them, he put a bunch of them together, I think, is just how I think he did it. And it was to change the breeding outcome of these goats. Jacob sort of knows that if he just wills this thing into existence, it's going to happen to him because God's on his side. He doesn't need any actual reasoning for why these rods would produce a good outcome for him. He's just sort of depending on his relationship with God to take care of him. And it only takes two. I mean, he only needs two of these animals that were going to be speckled or spotted to be able to have more. So he knows that he doesn't really need much, and he can reproduce it. I mean, he's been doing it for Laban this whole time. Laban doesn't understand all that Jacob truly, the power that Jacob really has and the abilities that he has. So Jacob knows that he's going to be able to do this. God's probably kind of playing along yeah, it's totally the rods that are doing this, but he didn't really need the rods. It's a little unconventional with setting up the rods. But I probably would have just used a staff if it was me. But either way, he also uses work ethic too, is mentioned in here, and logical thinking. That he can just breed these stronger animals together, the ones that were stronger. He also bred the stronger ones together as well. So he bred the stronger animals with the ones that were spotted and speckled, and it just starts to create this explosion, or all these other flocks that come out of it. Just like I said, all he needs is two. But he probably had this dominion, this animal whisperer type power. And that's one reason I would maybe watch the movie, because this whole thing with the rods is kind of confusing. And if you go watch the movie, just kind of see how they depict it. It's a little easier to understand. He kind of uses the rods, sets them up when he wants them to breed, and then he puts them in the water when he doesn't, or something like that. I mean, if you read through it and you're kind of struggling, I would maybe just go watch the movie. But ultimately, it's just a way to manipulate the breeding outcome. And so he grew. So it says at the end of that chapter, moreover, whenever the hardier animals were in heat, Jacob would set the rods in the troughs in full view of these animals, so that they mated by the rods. But with the weaker animals, he would not put the rods there. as I was saying earlier. So the feeble animals would go to Laban, but the sturdy ones to Jacob. Thus the man grew increasingly prosperous, and he came to own not only large flocks, but also male and female servants and camels and donkeys and all kinds of stuff. So he's growing into this big, powerful sort of matriarch or patriarch. He's growing into this big patriarch that has like all these people that are following him. All right, so that was chapter 30. Now we're going into chapter 31. So chapter 31 begins, and Jacob learns that Laban's sons were saying that Jacob is sort of taking advantage of their father's land, and it's starting to make Jacob wealthy. And Jacob is also noticing that Laban's attitude towards him is not the same as what it used to be. So God has to tell Jacob that it's time to go. Return to the land of your fathers where you were born, and I will be with you. And so Jacob has to start telling this to Leah and Rachel, and he pretty much tells them all about how Laban has been cheating him out of his wages. And Laban had this tendency to do this regardless, but he just tells them like Laban was trying to take all the wages that we agreed on with the goats. He had his sons take the goats that were supposed to be his, and how he had used God's favor to reclaim Laban's livestock. So he's sort of selling God to Leah and Rachel here. And he tells them about this dream in which God's messenger revealed himself, and there were these goats. This recent maneuver that Jacob got with the spotted sheep to breed. He tells them all about that. And then let me just kind of read a little bit of it. In the dream, so this is Jacob telling this to his wives. In the dream, God's messenger called to me, Jacob, here I replied. Then he said, note well, all the he goats in the flock as they mate are streaked, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen all things that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God who appeared to you in Bethel, where you anointed a memorial stone and made a vow to me. Up then, leave this land and return to the land of your birth. And the girls, after he explains what he's trying to do and why he's trying to leave, the girls are like, yeah, we are 100% with you. We don't have an heir's portion in his house anyways. We are treated like outsiders by him. He not only sold us, but he even used the money that he got for us. He used up all that money. And they recognize God as well as, and they say that all the wealth that God had reclaimed from our father really belongs to us and our children, not to Laban. So do what God told you is pretty much what they say. They fully support Jacob, which is good to get from your wife, or wives in this case. So now Jacob gathered everything and left out from Padanaram to go back to the land of Canaan. And Rachel does something here. We don't really know her intentions fully, but she steals her father's household idols. There's a couple different things why she could be doing this. Is this to get back at her father? Is she trying to uncover the false power of these idols? Is she trying to take power away from her father? Some of these people are in a limbo state as far as following God, the one true God, and also holding on to these man-made idols, which we even see that in our own society. People are continually sort of trying to do both. I'm going to do I'm going to be heavy into zodiac signs and every other thing, but I'm also going to follow God. And that's kind of what I think is happening here. She's trying to do both, and she's trying to take the power that she thinks they might have away from her father. We don't really know exactly what her intentions are at this point, at least. So Jacob hoodwinked Laban, or sort of just maneuvered away from him in a sudden fashion, is kind of what hoodwink is like. He left out in the middle of the night. So Jacob hoodwinks Laban by not telling him of the flight away from him, and he escaped with everything and crossed the Euphrates and headed for the highlands of Gilead. On the third day, Laban had heard about it, and he takes off to catch up with him. It took him 7 days, but the night he caught up with him, God appeared to him in a dream and said, don't mess with Jacob. Take care not to threaten Jacob with any harm. So they still have to confront each other, which happens in verse 25. We'll just go ahead and read some of it. So when Laban overtook Jacob, Jacob's tents were pitched in the highlands. Jacob also pitched his tents there on Mount Gilead. What do you mean? Laban demanded of Jacob. By hoodwinking me and carrying off my daughters like war captives, why did you dupe me by stealing away secretly? You should have told me. I would have sent you off with Mary singing to the sound of tambourines and harps. You didn't even allow me a parting kiss to my daughters and grandchildren. Jacob probably should have approached that differently, but there's a reason why Jacob does what he does. What you have now done is a senseless thing. I have it in my power to harm all of you, but last night the God of your father said to me, take care not to threaten Jacob with any harm. Granted that you have had to leave because of you were desperately homesick for your father's house. Why did you steal my gods? I was frightened, Jacob replied. I was frightened. Jacob replied to Laban at the thought that you might take my daughters away from me by force. But as for your gods, the one that you find with them, this shall not remain alive, or they would not remain alive. So Jacob's like, I don't know anything about stealing your gods. And in fact, anybody out of my bunch who took your gods, we're going to have him killed. He's not playing around about stealing the gods. But we see a lot of emotion from Laban here. And, he's like saying like he's lucky that God came to him in a dream. But deep down, I don't think Laban needed much convincing that, from God to not harm his own grandchildren. And kill the father of, all of his grandchildren. But anyways, Jacob, also emotional, says he was frightened and says he's going to kill whoever stole the idols, which we just read. So Laban goes through the entire camp looking for these idols, and Rachel takes them and puts them in a camel cushion and sits on them. And when he comes in looking for them, she tells him, sorry, father, I can't get up. It's that time of the month. Which, side note, but there are many things in the Bible that we read about that our modern society mimics as far as telling stories. We often see maybe in movies where somebody might be using this exact thing about being on their time of the month to sneak away to the bathroom or whatever it might be. But there's many examples like that. I'll try to point them out when we can, but there's a lot of things that originated in the Bible and have sort of made their way just without even realizing it into a lot of media, into a lot of movies and stuff. And this is one of them. Hey, even talking animals is another one where we see talking animals in here, and then we don't even think about where was the first story of a talking animal or whatever. So it was here. Anyways, so now Laban cannot find the idols, and Jacob just lets him have it. I mean, he really unloads everything that he's been holding on to. Which, by the way, if your gods can be stolen, find a new god. Shout out Pastor Paul at Calvary Chapel. But that is so true. Like if you just can't, if your gods can just be stolen by a human being, then there's probably not good. It's just not an actual valid God to have. But Jacob lets Laban have it here. In the 20 years that I was under you, no you or she goat of yours have ever miscarried, and I have never feasted on a ram of your flock. I have never brought you an animal torn by wild beasts. I made good the loss of myself, which was actually, that even goes against the law of Hammurabi, which in the ancient Near East, if an act of God occurred, or if something like out of your control happened, like an attack on one of your flock, or anything that you couldn't control, then it wasn't supposed to go against you. But Jacob was basically, Jacob was taking responsibility himself anyways when he didn't have to. So I just thought that was pretty neat, kind of reading about how the customs of the ancient Near East, even Laban wasn't even holding those standards to himself. He was finding fault in anything Jacob did, even though it wasn't his fault, and Jacob was taking responsibility for it. And that's why he says, I made good the loss myself. You held me responsible for anything stolen by day or night. How often the scorching heat ravaged me by day, and the frost by night, while sleep fled from my eyes. It just, man, he really worked hard for him. You can tell that here. Of the 20 years that I have now spent in your household, I slaved 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, while you changed my wages time after time. If my ancestral God, the God of Abraham and the God of Abraham and the awesome one Isaac had not been on my side, you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw my plight and the fruits of my toil, and last night he gave me my judgment. I mean, just a very powerful thing to say here. I think Jacob's just fed up with how Laban had been treating him. And we see him, using the word slave here, which is a different type of thing than how we think about. We're not expected to be a slave to someone for 14 years just to marry their daughter. And so this early family, I mean, they're made up largely of servants, or it's like they're themselves are a sort of a slave class. And I mean, Jacob willingly went into this for this indentured servitude type of time period. It's not like the same way that we think about slavery from the recent American history. But when you think about the 2 other wives the 2 other servant girls having children in this family, Jacob himself being, I mean, these people very much are coming from this servant class. And this tribe has all these different types of people. It's a diverse group of people. But anyways, so Jacob really lays it on to Laban here. And Laban responds back and is like, everything is his, the flocks, the children. I think he understood that Jacob had a point, and all he can really say is, these women are mine, these flocks are mine, but since it is his daughters, he wants to do a pact, and he wants everything to be good again, which makes sense. So they gather these stones, and it's going to stand as a witness. And Laban, I think Jacob and Laban are ready to just make peace. But it's very much under the condition that, God is going to watch this whole thing play out. And that's mentioned in here. God is going to be a witness to this. So even though they're making a pact, they're like, God is going to be the one that watch this to make sure that it's going to play out the way it should. So Laban mentions that Jacob is not supposed to take any other wives, and that they shouldn't be mistreated. And so God is going to be a witness between you and me. So he's like making this pact, but he's saying like, God is going to be the one that watches this stuff happen. Sorry, I know I said that already, but But this is good to hear. I think often we think of women being mistreated, and it's clear that he really does his. As far as like back in the day, we think about women sort of in the ancient times, probably mistreated all the time by in different societies. But in this society, he doesn't. He's That's doesn't going to happen. It's not going to happen as much, and it's sort of being proclaimed right here, even by Laban to Jacob. Um, but it's really clear that he loves his daughters, and a father's protection is sort of always a constant. And it's just cool to see that it existed, 4,000 years ago. Um, and so he says this covenant, basically declaring this promise, this stone will be a witness to hostile intent or anything that is bad that's going to happen. The God, or in Laban's putting a lot of emphasis on the stone, but this mound shall be a witness, but really it is a memorial stone will be a witness. But me and we know that really the only witness is going to be God. So they enter. So the stone will be a witness to hostile intent. They neither Laban or him should go past the stone into each other's territory. So it's also kind of a geographical marker. He does acknowledge God, but he also mentions the lowercase God of Nahor, which is interesting. So it's like the limbo sort of, I'm going to recognize the one true God, but also sort of hold on to these other gods. And then it goes on to say that Jacob took an oath and then offered a sacrifice and then invited his kinsmen in to share the meal, which another sort of question, which I maybe not went over, but like these animals that were sacrificed, did they eat the animals? And yes, they did. The priest, the Levitical priest, which we'll read about later, they were also sort of served as the butchers. This was really cool to see in a video with Matt Dillahunty and Glenn Scrivener, where there's a back and forth between Matt Dillahunty, who's an atheist, and sort of questioning these sacrificial ritual, this blood ritual of these animals, and Glenn Scrivener, I think I'm saying that right, does a really good job of explaining, that they were sacrificed, sure, but this was done in a way that gave life, because we eat the sacrifice, or we eat these things, in the same way the forgiveness of sins through Christ also gives us life. That's why we don't have to kill the animals in regards to having a sacrifice anymore. It says they ate the meal and they passed the night on the mountain. So yay, everything is happy again. It's a good day. And now we have this family of God. It's not just one or two people. We have this entire tribe forming, and this tribe has a wide diversity of people in it. They have Laban's influence sort of still in there. Many of them came from servants, like we mentioned, but this is actually really exciting to see how God's family is going to grow into the society that God will be leading and forming over many years. Okay, chapter 32. Now we're on to chapter 32. So early the next morning, Laban kissed all of his grandchildren goodbye and set back for his journey home, while Jacob continued on his way. Isn't it interesting that God sort of showed the weakness of these gods that Laban doesn't have? He has to go home and figure out what does Laban get back home and he's like, well, I don't have my gods. Does that lead him to maybe following the one true God? We don't know that. Who knows? But Rachel's actions of stealing those gods, it might have actually been a net positive, at least in terms of Laban's following of God. But it's sort of maybe like what was meant for evil, turning that into a good sort of situation. I don't know. But on the way back, something interesting happens with Jacob. Jacob is coming into the promised land, and he encounters God's messengers, and they inform him that he needs to set up camp at God's encampment. And he says, this is God's encampment, and that was the place at Mahanaim. And so you can see here that God has all these angels out doing reconnaissance, protecting Jacob from these larger tribes who Jacob's out on his own at this point, so he does need some protection. And honestly, these angels and these messengers just sort of doing this reconnaissance around Jacob, it's light work for God. I mean, and with the dreams and everything, this is like very minimal interaction with God here. We haven't even really gotten into God really fully, and there's going to be a lot to cover, but this is like light work for God. God will become more fully immersed into the warfare and all these different things. So Jacob still has other unfinished business that has probably been weighing heavy on him, and that's his brother Esau, who, he's still out there. Remember, Jacob was told by Esau that he was going to kill him once Isaac died. So Jacob probably still has that in his mind, and God knows that that's out there, and that's why he has these messengers. Now it says Jacob sent these messengers, and the messengers basically are supposed to tell Esau that Jacob had acquired all this stuff and he wants to be peaceful and gain his favor, meaning like, take whatever you need, just don't hurt me. And these messengers come back and tell him, okay, we told him, but he's coming with 400 men. So Jacob gets really frightened, because that's a lot of people, that's a lot of men, and Jacob doesn't have nearly that amount of manpower to fight him. So Jacob gets really frightened. He takes his people and he divides them into two different groups, and he says, hopefully he kills one group and not the other. So he's trying to just survive whatever way he can. And Jacob just spills it. I mean, he is scared to death of Esau here. He really expresses that he needs God, and I think we all go through that at one point. I feel he wants us to be honest with him. So God responds to honesty. If we're honest with him, it's going to be a lot better than sort of portraying that you're not afraid of something or whatever. So he says, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, you told me, O Lord, go back to the land of your birth, and I will be good to you. I am unworthy of all that acts of kindness that you have loyally performed for your servant. Although I crossed the Jordan here with nothing but my staff, I have now grown into 2 companies. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau. Otherwise, I fear that when he comes, he will strike me down and slay the mothers and children. You said yourself, I will be very good to you, and I will make your descendants like the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. So he's sort of putting a responsibility on God right here to protect him. And God doesn't necessarily really have a problem with this, or just in how this all plays out, he doesn't seem to have a problem with this. So it's important, though. I mean, he starts off with prayer, which is important. This is really a prayer to God for protection. And God does have, a lot of reasons why he needs Jacob to be protected as well. And so after the passing the night, Jacob does this, basically has this strategy of sending out these gifts to Esau. And so we'll just kind of see, but it's 200 she-goats, 20 he-goats, 20 male goats, 200 sheep, 20 rams, 30 camels with their young, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, 10 donkeys. So altogether, it's like 550 animals. And I think he went light on the donkeys because I think he's going to need that to carry his stuff because he's going to be traveling. But man, that's a lot. It's a lot of livestock value. It's a whole farm essentially. I mean, it's a lot to have, especially if there's ever a drought. They're going to need all these animals. But he willingly gives them to Esau. And Jacob is basically going to send his servants in droves to Esau. He's going to send out his servants with these animals in droves to Esau, which is kind of just a show of good faith and trying to approach this in a way that is going to be more peaceful than if he was maybe just trying to run away or some other type of reaction. And I honestly think we sort of see a glimmer of Christ here, which says to go be reconciled first with your enemy, which is Matthew chapter 5, to settle matters quickly before they go to court or get out of hand. And he's sending out messages of peace, all these animals. He's sending out messages of peace rather than war. So I guess from an overall view, it's not necessarily a bad thing what he's doing here, in my opinion. And Jacob, I mean, ultimately he's scared to fight Esau, and he never does that approach because he's 100% at Esau's mercy. I mean, Jacob has some men, and that's in his family, but he doesn't have 400 men. And even the men that he has, he doesn't want to see these people die and trying to fight off his brother. So Jacob sends gifts ahead of himself, which I think is just a smart thing to do, and it's why he's in the position he's in. He's creative. He doesn't mind making peace and being generous when he can. Picking up in verse 21, your servant Jacob is right behind us. So he tells his servants to make sure that, to pass along the message that Jacob is right behind them. So he tells them, he says, your servant Jacob is right behind us for Jacob reason. If I first appease him with gifts that precede me, then later, when I face him, perhaps he will forgive me. So the gifts went out ahead of him while he stayed that night in the camp. So he's just trying to, he's really just trying to survive here. Jacob gathers all of his wives and all of his children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. So he took them, and they all crossed with all the possessions. And at some point, so this is after he sent out all the animals. Now he's still on his journey, and he's crossing this river. And at some point during this crossing, he gets left alone with some man, which it's just kind of a mystery. The way this whole thing plays out. But I think it's kind of supposed to be, because it just says some man in the beginning. Some man wrestled with him. And this is like a pretty spectacular piece of the Bible, chapter 32. And we'll just kind of read it. But in the course of that night, however, Jacob arose, took his 2 wives with the 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And after he had taken them across the stream and had brought over all of his possessions, Jacob was left there alone. Then some man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When the man saw that he could not prevail over him, he struck Jacob's hip at his socket, so that the hip socket was wrenched. And as they wrestled, the man then said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Jacob's just he can't let it go. He needs blessings. He needs blessings from Isaac. He needs blessings from God. "What is your name?" the man asked. He answered, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be spoken of as Jacob, but as Israel, because you have now contended with divine and human beings and have prevailed." Jacob then asked him, "Do tell me your name, please." He answered, "Why should you want to know my name?" With that, he bade him farewell. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I have seen God face to face, he said, yet my life has been spared. At sunrise, he left Peniel. Jacob limped along because of his hip, and that is why to this day the Israelites do not eat the sciatic muscle that is on the hip socket. So very, very, very just, I mean, this part of the Bible is highly discussed. So does Jacob see God here? And yes, he did. He definitely see God. Let's think about it from the creationist perspective. God is the creator of all things. We've already established he has a spirit, that he was able to breathe the breath of life into man. He had created sons and angels and all these different things. He created Adam. And so if he's going to take the form of man, he could have done this. For me, the Trinity is not that hard to understand because of a creationist sort of foundation in a way. As far as like a belief structure, it's just not that difficult to understand. Now, I don't think this man is Christ. It could be, I guess, but I think Christ exists for a different purpose. And really, I do really think God needed sort of to unplug and go down on earth and just see what's up with Jacob. And we see many times like God using angels and different things to sort of carry out commands and set things in motion. But for me, I really do think that God needed to go down there himself. So, I don't see a big doubt, or with the being a creationist, I don't see how you could not understand how the Trinity could be possible. I mean, there's a lot of mystery to the Trinity. But for me, I think God just chooses to take three different forms. I think he fully came down to live as man, full with the Holy Spirit, and that's what Christ is, and that's what's different than this man. That's just sort of coming down for one small function and then leaving, whereas Christ came down to live an entire life played out. But it's what makes Christ different than the Father. And it's just the three forms that God chooses to take. So Christ is like more like the earthly Christ that existed 2,000 years ago was limited in the things that he could do because he was serving a different type of purpose. And he limited himself. That's important to understand. Whereas God the Father can take more different types of forms. So now the Holy Spirit is a big game changer because there's a lot more fluidity there. And I think he created this man in sort of the same way that he created Adam, which was just for one purpose. And I think that this purpose of this man that he created here in chapter 32 was to test his creation on a more physical, like tangible sort of way. It's just sort of like a functional avatar that he was available for this task. And that's, I think, the best way I can explain it. He has angels that are going to do different tasks and stuff. Well, whatever this man was, this was the task. This was the function of this one being. And it was that so God could live. God created this man to go down there to basically wrestle with Jacob. So yeah, I believe God takes the form of man here to wrestle with Jacob, and wrestling with God is sort of Jacob's character. How his character has been so far is that he is wrestling with God, fully trying to, think about like the bargaining with God and the deceiving. And I think there's many instances when he wants to follow God truly, but he's sort of wrestling with this concept. And I think it's a lot of what we do as a prodigal son. I can resonate with that. And God allows us to wrestle with him. It's almost a part of our nature to do that. Everybody's going to wrestle with God on something. I think, parts of my life, and it's like why we call this podcast the PODigal Sons. I've wrestled with God on a spiritual level and a logical level as well, just going back and forth. Why is this done? Why was that done? Why are there so many denominations? Like whatever, there's different types of wrestling that we do. And he's here for it. He's here for that. God's like, show me what you got. I'm still going to bless you even if you lose. We have all these times where we wrestle with God, and God knows that, we're going to lose ultimately. But he's still going to bless us. And that's exactly what happens here. So it's really cool. This whole thing is really cool. God, I think, really wants to know Jacob, and that's why he makes this appearance. And when I mean know someone, there's a really cool scene in The Matrix where Neo is going to meet the Oracle, but he encounters like the protector of the Oracle, and so the protector, I'm sure he has a name, but he fights Neo, and Neo's like, "What was that about?" And he tells him, he says, "You do not truly know someone until you fight them." And whether that's physically or verbally, I mean, there's some truth to that. You don't really know someone until you've like engaged with them. I can think about times where I had it out with someone, and you just come out of it with a different understanding, and you feel closer to that person. This can happen with your spouse. Not saying like, not ever physical, but verbally or whatever, where you're just going back and forth, and there's some disagreement, but you have it out, and it's really just like this communication. Well, this is a different type of communicating, and I think God really wanted to feel, I think he wanted to really know Jacob, and I think that's why this is done. I'll bring up the 1994 movie that we discussed on this, and I think they get it wrong. I don't think that's how it happened. And I do have a little bit of an MMA background and did some boxing stuff. So I read about this wrestling match, and I picture this thing took all night, just as it says. I think that Jacob was really tired, and he didn't give up, and God sees that, and God was probably toying with him for a long time. And there's some MMA matches that you could go out there and watch that you play out for all 5 rounds, 5-minute rounds, and seem like they could go on forever. And I think that's what happened here. I think they were wrestling for hours. But God kind of just wants to see what he's made of. Like, he wants to see, like, is Jacob going to fight through this? Is he going to run away? Is he going to be scared? And he wants to test Jacob's courage, but also I think he wants to inspire Jacob more than anything. I think that's a focus that, I don't want to overlook that. He needs to instill in Jacob a sense of importance and confidence. And I think God accomplishes that here. Jacob, having wrestled with God, he can now kind of hold his head up and say, if I wrestle with God, I can wrestle with anybody. So by making this appearance, it gives Jacob this new title. It also cements this new identity. And he knows God a lot more. He knows God better now. And he fights for this blessing. And you know what? God is going to give it to him. So Israel is the father of the Jewish people. And remember, we were just sort of by ourselves before him. God hasn't really started reclaiming the earth yet after the Tower of Babel. This is sort of the start of a very long journey for these people. But he is creating the very first society of God. And then the whole hip socket thing kind of tells me, God is not afraid to be stern. He won't completely damage Jacob, but Jacob's going to remember that for the rest of his life. It's sort of the same maybe physical marker that like a circumcision kind of also is also kind of another physical marker that's going to stay with you for the rest of your life. So, all right, that was chapter 32. Moving on to chapter 33. I know this is a long podcast. If you're with me, I really appreciate you listening. Um, so Israel, we're going to call him Israel now. God changed his name, so that's a commandment. Um, so Esau, so he sees Esau coming, and I guess at this point he decided to just have his whole family with him. I guess maybe he changed but first he was trying to split them off into two groups. So Esau has 400 men. Esau's not doing too bad. And remember, God said that there would be two nations in his womb. So he goes out in front and bows down to Esau 7 times. Esau came to him, embraced him, and said everything's going to be fine. Basically, it's it's really cool to see that happen. And it's like, God's going to take care of you. And I think Jacob, after this embrace happens, he knows, like, hey, God's going to take care of me. If he didn't know that before, I mean, it's another thing that happens that gives him confidence. So he has all of his wives come out to greet Esau, and it's a sort of very tense situation. Even though they made up, you can still maybe kind of sense a little bit of, you can still, as you read through chapter 33, you can kind of still feel a little bit of tension in the room. And I think the movie, really vilifies Esau, but I think Esau, I mean, he's showing some mercy here. And Esau's like, so what was I supposed to do with all these animals? And let's just read that part. So Esau asked, what did you intend with all these droves that I encountered? Jacob answered, It was to gain my Lord's favor. I have plenty, replied Esau. You should keep what is yours, brother. No, I beg you, said Jacob. If you will do me this favor, please accept this gift from me, since to come into your presence is for me like coming into the presence of God, which is interesting. Now that you have received me so kindly. And I think he's just making a comparison with, treating with kindness and God, which is true. So Israel is very impressed with Esau's kindness, which is interesting, even making the comparison to God, which I'm sure Esau appreciates that. He probably kind of takes into his own vanity. So Esau said he was going to head one way towards Seir, and he wanted Jacob to come with him. Well, first off, Esau kind of he's like, fine, I'll just take the presents. Thank you for the presents, brother. And anyways, Esau says he's going to head towards Seir, and he wanted Jacob to come with him. And Jacob sort of tells him this soft little lie. It says, so Jacob replied, as my Lord can see, the children are frail. Besides, I am encumbered with the flocks and herds, which now have sucklings. If overdriven for a single day, the whole flock will die. Let my Lord then go on ahead of me, while I proceed more slowly at the pace of the livestock before me and at the pace of my children, until I join my Lord in Seir. He has no intention of going into Seir. So Esau's like, okay, that's fine. I'll put let me at least put at your disposal some of my men who are with me. And Jacob's like, no, don't do that. Like, it's fine. Because he knows he's going to go the other way. So we still see a little bit of some deception here, but I just think it was destiny, really, and it's probably just the most peaceful way for them to separate. He doesn't want his people to mix with Esau's people, and God is bringing them into the land that was dedicated for them. So Jacob went to Succoth and made a home for himself and made booths for his livestock. Booth, which is a temporary hut, that's going to come up later. Just kind of keep that in mind. It's like a temporary hut that his livestock lived in. Then he lands in Schechem, which is in the land of Canaan. He purchased some land from the descendants of Hamor. Hamor is going to come up again very soon. But these people came from someone other than Abraham, is all we really need to know. Probably Canaanites. We don't really know how much 100 pieces of bullion is, just kind of a generic amount of money that he purchased this land for. And he set up this memorial stone and invoked El, the God of Israel. And everything's great so far. So we kind of are back into this wonderful time. But as usual, when everything kind of seems good, we're about to be into something that's not so great. So let's get into chapter 34. It's a very tough chapter, touchy subject to read about. So trigger warning. But we're going to talk about some stuff that's hard to read about as far as sexual assault. So that's why studying the Bible is hard for like elementary school kids and even into your high school years. You're not really meant to, I don't think you really start understanding the Bible until you're after you're into your 20s, which is a lot of times after confirmation for a lot of Catholics. And I think to try to teach try to teach a lot of stuff to high school students, and some of this stuff is just hard because your brain's still developing. There's just a lot of these tough subjects that you don't really, it's hard to really process some of this. But anyways, so you have Dinah, who, remember, that's the daughter of Leah. It's the only daughter, it's like the little sister in this whole situation. It says that she went out to visit some of the women in the land. To be honest, I don't really know what they mean by it, what's supposed to be meant by that. In my opinion, she's doing in what's innocent, or what seems to be innocent, even though it might not be. All I'm going off of is that just she visited some women in the land that they were living in. So I am going to sort of come at it from the angle of defending her, even just, and because visiting women, even though it's looked at like she's visiting these pagan women and that could be a bad influence, it's like we don't really know what's going on in that regard necessarily. She doesn't have any sisters, so let's keep that in mind. She only has brothers, but she doesn't have any like younger siblings that she can probably relate to as much. So another reason she could have went and been with some of these women, just to have friends. She went out away from her brothers, which that also might have been a reason. So tough to assume anything here. It could have been like, I'm seeing this as the same way as like someone sneaking out at night to go to a club or something. It's not a great situation if that's the case, but we don't really know what's going on. She didn't go with any protection, and it's definitely something that's, at this ancient times, it's not going to lead to good outcomes. But the last thing I want to do is sort of just like victim blame her in this case, because all she did in this text is visit these women. So, all right. We don't really know the circumstances, but last I checked, visiting women is completely fine to do. They might have been godless women, but technically that's not a reason to not visit them, actually. Remember, we are called to be in the world, not of the world. Shout out Grace Fellowship. But so visiting them, even if, what's the harm of visiting someone if just because they're different from you or they have different views? It's not necessarily wrong. Even though at the time I understand that, yes, her visiting them could have had not the best implications, but I'm going to kind of stick at just what the text says, and all it says is she was visiting them. These surrounding towns are going to have this pattern of immorality. Let's think about Sodom and some of these other places. They weren't supposed to mingle with the Canaanites. So there is an aspect of you're supposed to honor your mother and father, which, she shouldn't have done this in secret if that's what she was doing. But anyways, so this guy Schechem, who is the son of Hamor, and these are the Hivites that this guy that Jacob bought the land from this guy Hamor is the leader of the Hivites, and he has his son Schechem. Schechem does this terrible thing and forcibly lays with Dinah, which is just a very serious SA charge against her that he does. And it says he sort of does it out of love, but he doesn't, right? He does this out of lust. And even if he loves her, whatever, it's not the proper way to do things. And he couldn't wait to do things the proper way. And it says he was endeavored to win her affection. But I mean, think about the way Jacob treated trying to be with Rachel versus what he's doing here. I mean, we're talking about somebody that willingly served for a full month to someone before they even negotiated what was going to happen with his marriage to Rachel. And then there was 7 years. So to go from that to this, I mean, that is an obvious contrast of godly people versus ungodly people and what they do. Godly people court their women and they serve in order to be with them. These are two different ways in which this courting process obviously is different with how Jacob approached Laban and how this is happening with Schechem. So he's supposedly doing this out of a place of affection, but ultimately, he does this awful thing. And there are some laws you can go find, like I've been mentioning, the Code of Hammurabi, which dates back to like 2200 BC. And you definitely could not like force yourself on other people's wives, and probably daughters to an extent. But there are no like people policing this area. This world was just completely different. There's nobody that's going to help Dinah here, and these people are living out, and they're at the mercy of whoever ran that territory, which it was the Hivites. So this whole concept of law is kind of just now starting. But this very much is a violation of her, and the Israelites are not going to respond well to this. So Schechem asks his father, can you get this girl for me as a wife? And Jacob hears about this while his sons are out in the field, and he just kind of becomes quiet. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad reaction. I think he does, need to show some emotion that he's affected by this, but at the same time, I think he's learning about this, and he's realizing and thinking there's probably a bigger issue that's happening with the surrounding people. And I think he just goes into thinking, and this calm sort of reaction might not necessarily be a bad thing. Whenever something traumatic happens, I don't think the best response necessarily is to just sort of take arms immediately. So it's just interesting that he has this sort of graceful sort of response here. But he recognizes there's probably a bigger issue with these neighboring group of people, which is the Hivites. So Hamor, the father of Schechem, went out to discuss the matter with Jacob, and that's how you know that Schechem really messed up, because his father knows about it, and he's going out to try to proactively work something with Jacob. There's no like accusations taking place. This is just simply, they realize that they're in the wrong and they need to try to make it right however they think is possible. But word had spread about God to a lot of these neighboring groups, like the same way Abimelech knew about God. And now Esau's tribe all comes from Abraham as well. So even the tribes of Ishmael has to be included in that. So the word is sort of out, and they probably realize they've messed with the wrong people in a way. But anyways, the brothers learn about it, and they are just indignant, and I mean, they're sort of rightfully aggravated about this. Hamor says he wants Dinah to marry his son, and they are going to all live together, and there's going to be one big family, and they're going to do a celebration and sing camp songs and do a big kumbaya, right? I mean, it's just, they're totally coming about this in the wrong way. And let's keep in mind, these people worshipped idols. So they're just, they don't really have a good sense of humanity. It seems they're just kind of in this more savage type of lifestyle that they seem to be living in. And Schechem comes in and kind of says how he throws in his little 2 cents about he will pay the bridal price no matter how high it is. Only give me the maiden in marriage, he says. And honestly, that's just very, I actually read this and was like offended for Jacob in this sense, because the first words out of your mouth should have been like, we're so sorry, please don't kill us, my son made a mistake, just don't kill us, is what they should have said. They should have probably brought gifts and the whole 9 yards. I mean, think about what we've seen so far. When somebody messed up, Jacob was giving out gifts to Esau when he didn't even do anything wrong necessarily. Or if he did, it was from 30 years ago or whatever. So, but they are sort of just like making demands here, they didn't approach this at all in the right way. And I mean, think about all what, like I just mentioned, what Jacob went through for Rachel. I mean, just ridiculous contrast there. So I just don't know how I feel about, this. I think there's obvious connection, and there's something that can be obviously said. I don't know how I feel about, I don't have any sympathy for these people, because what we're about to read there's going to be more that happen from this, but I just don't have any sympathy that much for these people. And I think it's just different between how they carry themselves, between the godly and the ungodly. So now we have Jacob's sons, and let's think about where they come from. They come from Jacob and Leah. We have Leah, who was somewhat of a trickster, coming from Laban and sort of taking part in that trick to trick Jacob. And then we have Jacob, obviously a trickster himself, and they have 6 sons, and the 7th sibling is this is Dinah, who is the younger sister out of all this. And we have the offspring of what really is kind of an odd sort of power couple, really. But the combination of those two and these 6 sons that come out of them, I mean, we see a combination, and I think it creates somewhat of, I would say they are very dangerous in what they're capable of. And so how do you expect these guys to act, and how are they going to approach this? I mean, they deceive the ever-living crap out of these Hivites. They tell them it's even, because the whole proposal of them getting married, they respond and they say it's disgraceful to even think about their sister with an uncircumcised man. And it's just interesting that now we're coming back and we're having to talk again about circumcision, but they tell them that their whole entire tribe has to be circumcised if they want to marry off their sister, and if they want to be sort of an intermingled community, which just sort of sounds like an adoption, like they're going to adopt these people. And maybe under different circumstances, in a more Christ-like manner, that could have been what happened. But they say if they do this, then they can have their sister, and then they agree. He agrees to get circumcised. He has no problem doing it. He doesn't waste any time. He's eager to get this done. He goes and convinces his whole tribe to do this, and they do this with all the males. I guess it was like a group thing that they do all these circumcisions. And On the third day, they were still in a lot of pain. Simeon and Levi, who were Leah's full brothers, the second and third sons. Reuben was the first son, which he didn't. Interesting that he didn't really spearhead this thing, but Levi and Simeon, who probably had others with them, they go out, and while these guys were struggling with the circumcision they just had, they were in no condition to fight off anything because of they just had a major part of themselves removed. So they're still recovering from that and very vulnerable, very vulnerable. Levi and Simeon and probably some others go in and they just slaughter all these people. It says all the males, all the able-bodied males were slaughtered. And I mean, this is a mass murder, and a lot of these guys were innocent. I say innocent because we don't really know any other circumstances. But what I was saying earlier is these people obviously carried themselves differently. They were probably doing other things beyond just the essay that happens. But I mean, the Israelites here really do not play around. But it's not a good thing, right? This is just going to lead to further destruction, further tensions. A lot of these men did not deserve to die for this. They didn't have anything to do with this sexual assault that happened. And the biggest mistake that I think Levi and Simeon make is they never turn to God to pray. None of them do. Just they don't ask God should they do in this situation. But let's consider, what happens if they kill Shechem? Let's say they just kill Shechem. Then what? Is Hamor just going to sit back and watch them kill their son? Probably not. This would have probably started a war either way. We don't really know that, but I mean, this is the ancient world we're talking about. So something as simple, or what seems like is just one event between two people, being Shechem and Dinah, actually there's something bigger going on, and and that's why you don't just take things in your own hands like Shechem did and go about it the wrong way, because it can have lethal consequences. But the other brothers come in after Levi and Simeon do that, and they just ransack everything. Flocks, herds, wealth, silver, probably. Even the women and children. Why did they take the women and children? I don't really know. I mean, it's sort of just built into our natural instincts to just kind of take whatever you can. Plunder of war goes back to forever. It's always a theme. I don't see how the children didn't want to eventually take revenge on what happened to their parents, but it does say that there were no able-bodied males left, so we don't really know. There probably wasn't much fight in these children that were left. And also, I can only assume that these people went with them for survival purposes. They didn't really have a choice, and they just sort of fell in line. So this vengeance was a big overreach and not a good thing, considering how many innocent people died. And Jacob says to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble upon me by making me loathsome to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. I have so few men that if these people unite against me and attack me, and I and my family will be wiped out." But they retorted, "Should our sister have been treated like a harlot?" And remember, Jacob's supposed to be the commander of this thing, and they just sort of go and do their own thing without asking him. And he's like, how could we, he says, now we could really have an issue with being targeted for this wrathful, hateful thing that you guys did. And they kind of respond like, well, what were we supposed to do? And Jacob stays silent. And I think his silence actually means something here. He doesn't have a good response because he probably didn't really mind the revenge. Let's just be honest. I think he probably understood that something was going to happen either way. Either they try to persecutes Schechem, which I don't know how that would have went with him being the son of the leader of the Hivites. So, but where's the forgiveness at in this whole thing? And we don't really have that as a major theme in these people's lives yet, because Christ hasn't come. It's just sort of natural that these people do this, and I think God knows this, but just an obvious thing that humans will do is they take revenge when something happens to them. And as much as bad of a thing that it is that they did this, I mean, let's also not forget, like, what came out of this is you do not mess with these people. They're crazy smart. They are cunning. They have God with them. So, I mean, watch out, because anytime somebody tries to battle the Israelites, it's not going to, there could be some things that, you got to be careful of. And messing with the Israelites is one. So anyways, another big takeaway, and you can now add this to the running list of things. But all these lustful actions that we saw, like with Sodom and some of the other examples, they're going to have these deadly sort of consequences. So, and we see all that in the modern world, it can have terrible consequences, whether that's trauma or a murder that happens, or whatever it is. But this lustful thing, this theme of men not being able to control their lust, I mean, it's a continual problem. All right, so we're into chapter 35 now. And chapter 35 starts, I mean, God still blesses these people, even though they didn't handle the situation with Dinah correctly, really. God is not going to leave them. And same way, he's not going to leave you or me or you just because, we mess around and take out an entire group of village of people. Like, he's still going to be by our side. So God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel, settle there, and build an altar there to God who appeared to you while you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob told his family and all the others who were with him, get rid of the foreign gods that you have among you and purify yourselves and put on fresh clothes. We are to go now to Bethel, and I will build an altar there to the God who answered me in my hour of distress. So these people that were even with Jacob were worshiping the wrong thing, and that needs to be corrected. He's kind of saying, hey, things are about to get serious, so you guys need to be suited and booted to deal with the commitment we're about to make. And really what he just means is, like, his following of God is about to take a different light. This thing with these false idols is something the Israelites continually deal with. But as of right now, these people that are in this family are still kind of holding on to the handmade gods. But they turned all that over. They turned their rings over, which also sort of signify like a pagan magic. That's where the people used to wear. That's why they kind of wore these rings. They got different clothes on. It's just like a different identity. Terror fell out from all the people around them, that they were kind of worried. Jacob was worried that the surrounding groups were going to respond. Well, God instills a terror in these people, and he's protecting them, even though they're flawed, just like he protects us, even though we are flawed. And he shows them grace here. They get blessings when they're undeserved. I can't think of how many times I've received blessings, even though they were undeserved. But also, it's probably not difficult for them to, they already have a lot of reasons why these people should fear them. You have Esau out there who's kind of probably spreading the word about his lineage. And then you just have what they did to the Hivites. I mean, that's probably making its way around that, these people are powerful and they can do some things. So he built an altar with all the people that were with him in that same spot to commemorate when God had been revealed to him. So he's back where he had the dream. It also mentions a little sad note about Rebecca's nurse, Deborah, who died This must have been a big deal. It sounds like she had a servant type relationship to the community, very Christ-like, serving the health of Rebecca. And God speaks to Jacob again in Bethel. And I think what he's kind of saying here is, Jacob is I think starting to catch on. Jacob said to him, whose name is Jacob shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Thus he was named Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed an assembly of nations, shall stem from you, and kings shall issue from your loins. The land I once gave to Abraham and Isaac, I now give to you and to your descendants after you. I will give this land. And then God departed from him on the site where God had spoken with him. So, I think things are starting to, God and Jacob's character has fully developed here into something completely different from where we started. What was originally, deceitful and sort of bargaining with God, it's now completely different. And I think Jacob has really, he's starting to include God, and he's starting to have his people turn away from these false idols, which is really important. But anyways, so we have this situation now on the way on. So from Bethel to Ephrath, while they were making this trip, Rachel went into labor again, and she had another son, which was great news. But as you're reading it, it's great news. But in the same breath, she dies in childbirth, which is just really sad. And this is kind of the first example that we see out of this punishment. Remember the punishment that was given to Eve? This is the first example where something happens in light of that punishment. And this is a very holy thing for her to do, in that she died in the service of Israel, her husband, the whole nation of Israel, really. And she died in the service of growing this family. Which, remember, it's just the first commandment from God, be fruitful and multiply, which at the time was very important. And so she died, even though it was a punishment. She died in the service of something. So it was, it's a bittersweet moment there, but it's something that it's part of human nature, and having to give birth is it's just a rough thing for women to go through. But we're not living in the Garden of Eden anymore, and God knows that. He's like, if you guys are going to leave me, just know that this is going to be a painful part of life, and that's what happens here. So she dies, giving birth to Benjamin. That's who's the son who's born out of that is Benjamin, and Jacob set up a memorial stone for her. We kind of know where Rachel's tomb is even to this day. So we'll kind of show that. Just very interesting. Very, very interesting. This family that we have, we find that's how we got to 12 sons. We have 2 from Rachel, 6 from Leah, and then the other 4 are from the servant girls. Kind of change up from what we just read, but Reuben is going to do something really weird here. He's going to sleep with one of Jacob's concubines, which, not good to have concubines, but Reuben does something really unwise here, and he takes one of Jacob's girlfriends, sort of how you could think about it, and sleeps with her, sleeps with Bilnah. And I guess it's just kind of a way to scold him for doing that. But it kind of quickly moves on. So, Jacob shouldn't have multiple wives, but Reuben shouldn't be sleeping with him if that's the case. So, kind of a weird family dynamic, but I don't think they have, they haven't had any opportunities probably to venture or settle. they haven't had any opportunities to settle and find women yet, so they're working on that. But anyways, we get a list of the 12 sons that they have because it's now complete. And Jacob went home to his father, which he didn't have that long left. Isaac doesn't have that much longer. That's why he goes home. He ends up dying at 180. Remember when I said that he was sort of being a little dramatic about dying so soon because he lives for another 30, 40 years or something. But anyways, he breathed his last breath. He breathed his last breath, and Jacob and Esau sort of reunite and bury him. I wonder if Esau was like, hey, I thought you were coming to be with me and see her. And I guess that never got brought up. But they reunite to bury Isaac. So we read about the death of Isaac here. All right, chapter 36, very short. It's going to be brief. This is basically just a chapter about Esau and his lineage and his family. Esau gets separated by the family of God here, and it's himself sort of choosing this lifestyle. He chose the Canaanite women like his father said not to. He said that he had a wife from the daughter of Ishmael, which we already read about that, which I guess that's a little different. Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the members of his household, as well as his livestock, comprising various animals and all the property he had acquired in the land of Canaan. And went to the land of Seir, out of the way of his brother Jacob. Their possessions had become too great for them to dwell together, and the land in which they were staying could no longer support them because of their livestock. So Esau settled in the highlands of Seir. These are the descendants of Esau, ancestor of the Edomites in the highlands of Seir. And then it just goes through all the descendants of Esau and the clans that resulted, which kind of fulfilled the prophecy that there would be two nations born out of these two brothers. The Edomites are a group of people that are also sort of go at it with the Israelites, we'll read about. So the Edomites are going to just be the name for the descendants of Esau. These are going to pretty much turn into the Gentiles, essentially, or just groups of what we kind of call the Gentiles in the New Testament. It also goes through the existence of the Horites, Seir, the Horite, which we don't really know a whole lot about them or what they could have been. They could have actually been Neanderthals, something I read into. Just a hunch, kind of, not really based on anything, but they were destroyed by Esau's descendants. They were kind of supposed to be like a caveman group of people, probably a whole other rabbit hole. If we have time one day, maybe we go explore that or something. But verse 31, it says that they went to war with the Midianites. They had has a record of the succession of kings, which we mentioned, from Abraham's second wife, Keturah. So we now see these other people of God that are kind of outside of Israel, outside of the Israelites, whether that's the Canaanites or the Midianites or the Edomites. All these people, even though they come from God, they're not in the family of God, but they're kind of warring with each other. But they won, and there was a successor down to Hadar, who was the king of the city of Pile. So the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, had won against the Midianites. And it also has a different thing about the many clans of Esau, and they have different subdivisions. So either way, that's it, guys. Y'all can read through every single name if you want and make flashcards. But not the way that I do things for this podcast. We're probably going to, this Genesis takes a long time to get through and to explain. We're sort of setting it up in the beginning. These podcasts moving forward are not going to be 2, 3, 4 hours long. But Genesis is just going to take longer to get through. So thank you guys for joining me. Next week or next podcast, we're going to do chapters 37 through 43. That's Genesis chapters 37 through 43. Thank you so much for getting on the podcast with me. I love you guys. Take care.